Hector Grimes grabbed Evelyn Mercer's arm in the middle of the general store, right in front of every soul in Red Hollow, and squeezed hard enough to leave marks. "Your daddy owes me $60, he said, loud enough for the whole street to hear through the open door. "You got till Saturday, or I take the north pasture, every acre." Evelyn didn't flinch. She looked him dead in the eye and said, "Take your hand off me." He let go, but he smiled doing it. That was the worst part, the smile. If this is your first time here, welcome. And if you've been with us before, you already know these stories don't let go easily. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss what comes next, and drop a like while you're at it. Tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's get into it. The dress had been folded in a cedar chest for 7 years. Evelyn Mercer hadn't forgotten it was there. You don't forget something like that. A pale blue gown your mother stitched by hand through 3 winters, needle-pulling thread by lamplight, while her fingers went stiff in the cold, while she coughed into a cloth she hid from everyone. The dress was finished 4 months before the wedding. Her mother died 11 days after seeing it completed. And then Thomas Hale drowned in the Clearwater Crossing 6 weeks before the ceremony, and the dress went into the cedar chest, and Evelyn Mercer became a woman who did not talk about either of those things. That was 1881. This was 1888, and the chest sat at the foot of her bed like it always had, and every morning she stepped over the same patch of floor in front of it without looking down. She had a system. Most people who carry grief long enough develop one, a set of careful routes through their own life that avoid the worst of it. Evelyn's routes were efficient. She rose before the rest of the household, started the kitchen fire, made coffee strong enough to strip paint, and had breakfast half done before her father's boots hit the floor upstairs. She worked the ranch accounts after supper. She kept the pantry, managed the hired hands' wages, repaired harnesses when nobody else would bother. She stayed useful. Useful people don't have time to stand still long enough for grief to catch them. That was the theory, anyway. The morning Silas Boone rode onto Mercerland, Evelyn was standing in the north field in her mother's wedding dress. She did this once a year, in early May, when the wildflowers came up thick enough to look like something her mother would have loved. She never stayed long, 20 minutes, maybe 30. Long enough to feel the fabric against her skin, long enough to remember that the dress had been made with love before it became a symbol of everything that went wrong. She always went back to the field alone, and she always returned to the house before anyone else was stirring, and in 7 years, no one had ever seen her do it. She was walking back through the tall grass toward the fence line when she heard the horse. She stopped. The horse came over the low ridge from the direction of the road, a big gray gelding moving at an easy walk, and the man in the saddle wasn't anyone she recognized. He wasn't from Red Hollow. She would have known. Red Hollow was the kind of town where you knew every face by the sound of the boots they walked in. He pulled up when he saw her, not in a startled way, more like a man who had come around a bend and found a view he wasn't expecting and needed a moment to take it in properly. He sat on his horse in the early morning light with the wildflowers moving in the wind behind him, and he looked at her, and he said nothing for long enough that it started to feel like he might not say anything at all. Then he took off his hat. "Morning," he said. "Morning," Evelyn said, because there was nothing else to say. He looked at her for another second, not rude, not the way men sometimes looked at women they thought they could assess like livestock, more like he was trying to figure out what he was actually seeing and hadn't landed on an answer yet. "That's the most beautiful dress I've ever seen," he said. It was such a plain thing to say. No decoration on it, no charm, just a flat, honest statement that landed between them like a stone dropped in still water. And something in Evelyn Mercer cracked open without her permission. She had been prepared for a lot of responses. A smirk, a question, the particular kind of careful silence people used when they didn't know how to handle a grown woman standing alone in a field in a wedding gown before sunrise. She had not been prepared for a man who simply told the truth about what he saw, with no angle behind it. "It was made for my wedding," she said. The words came out before she thought about them, which was already unusual. Evelyn was not a woman who spoke before she thought. "To you," she added. Then she stopped breathing. She did not know where that had come from. The words had arrived from somewhere south of her rational mind, from some part of her that had apparently decided, without consulting the rest of her, that the appropriate response to a stranger on a horse was to say something that made absolutely no sense. The man on the horse blinked. "I'm sorry?" he said. "I didn't mean that," Evelyn said. Her face was hot. She was 30 years old. She had managed a working cattle ranch for 3 years. She had sat across the table from bankers and lawyers and men who believed a woman's signature on a document was decorative. And right now she wanted nothing more than for the ground to open up beneath her feet and swallow her whole. "I think maybe you did," the man said, but he said it quietly, without mockery, and he was still holding his hat at his side, and his expression was not what she would have expected from someone who'd just been told something bizarre by a stranger in a field. He looked like a man who understood what it meant to say something you hadn't meant to say. "I'm looking for Nathan Mercer," he said. "I was told he might have work." "He does," Evelyn said. "He's my father. I'm Evelyn Mercer." "Silas Boone." He settled his hat back on his head. "I'll come back when the hour's more reasonable." "The hour's fine," she said, because somehow letting him ride away felt worse than the conversation continuing. "Come to the house. Coffee's on." He looked at her for a moment, measuring something she couldn't name, then nodded and turned his horse toward the house. Evelyn walked behind him through the field, the hem of her dress dragging through the wet grass, and she told herself the warmth in her face was just the morning sun coming up over the ridge. She was very convincing. She had years of practice convincing herself of things. Nathan Mercer was a man built like a fence post, tall, weathered, not especially flexible in any direction. He had come west from Missouri in 1859, claimed his land before most of Wyoming had a name for itself, and spent the following 3 decades working it with the particular stubbornness of a man who has decided that this piece of ground is his argument with the world and he intends to win. His wife's death had not softened him. Thomas Hale's drowning had not softened him. What it had done was make him grip everything he still had a little tighter, including his daughter. He came downstairs to find a stranger sitting at his kitchen table drinking his coffee like he'd been doing it for years, and Evelyn standing at the stove with her back to the room, still in the blue dress, which meant the morning had already taken a turn Nathan hadn't predicted. "Who are you?" he said. "Silas Boone. I heard in town you might need hands for the spring roundup." Nathan looked at him the way he looked at horses he was considering, starting at the boots, moving up slow, not committing to anything. "Where'd you work last?" "Cartwright outfit, outside of Laramie. Before that, the Rocking H, up in Montana." "Why'd you leave Cartwright?" "Roundup finished." "And the Rocking H?" Silas picked up his coffee. "Foreman and I had a difference of opinion." "About what?" "About whether it was acceptable to work a horse past the point of usefulness and leave it in a ditch." He said it without heat, the way you state a fact that you've already made your peace with. "I didn't think it was." He disagreed. "I left." Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled out the chair across from Silas and sat down. "How long you been riding the circuit?" he said. 9, 10 years. "Family?" "Not anymore." Nathan glanced at Evelyn's back, then back at Silas. "I've got 1,200 head need moving to summer pasture and 3 hands down with fever. Pays fair. Works hard. You stay through the roundup, you get a bonus at the end." "That's acceptable," Silas said. "You any good with a rope?" "Good enough," Nathan grunted. In his vocabulary, that meant yes. Evelyn changed out of the dress before breakfast was on the table. She came back downstairs in her work clothes, canvas pants, a worn cotton shirt, boots that had seen better years, and set plates out without looking at their new hired hand, which was a strategy that lasted approximately 4 minutes. "You work accounts?" Silas said, nodding toward the ledger book she'd left open on the side table. "Yes," she said. "Your father's or the ranch's?" "Both. Same thing, mostly." "That's a lot of work on top of everything else." She set a plate in front of him. "Is it?" He looked up at her. "I'm not making conversation," he said. "I'm genuinely asking. It seems like a significant amount of work." She sat down across from him because the kitchen wasn't big enough to put more distance between them without being theatrical about it. "Someone has to do it. My brother Luke's 17. He's better in the field than at a desk. My father's the same." "And you?" "I'm good at whatever needs doing," she said. He looked like he believed her. He ate his breakfast without making a production of it, and he didn't say anything else for a while, and Evelyn found that easier to sit across from than most conversations she'd had in recent memory. That was the first warning sign, if she'd been paying attention to signs. The trouble with Hector Grimes had started 6 months before Silas Boone arrived, in November, when Nathan Mercer's oldest horse broke a leg in a ravine and they lost 2 days of work pulling the animal out, and Nathan ended up short on the fall payment to Grimes for grazing rights on the creek pasture. It was $60. Nathan paid $40 and promised the rest by spring. Grimes had smiled and said that was fine. Grimes was not a man whose smile meant things were fine. He ran a small empire in the Red Hollow Basin, 3 ranches, a stake in the feedlot, and what amounted to a private arrangement with the county land office that nobody talked about openly, but everybody knew was there. He was not crude about any of it. That was the thing about Hector Grimes that made him particularly dangerous. He was polite. He had good manners and clean boots, and he said please and thank you, and underneath all of that he was a man who understood that patience was a weapon if you held it long enough. The north pasture Nathan Mercer had was the piece Grimes wanted. 40 acres of creek-fed bottomland that ran rich with grass even in dry years. It sat between 2 parcels Grimes already owned, and the man had been trying to acquire it one way or another for the better part of a decade. He'd offered to buy it twice. Nathan had said no twice. Now Nathan owed him $60 he couldn't easily produce, and Grimes had a contract clause that said failure to pay in full by June first entitled him to seize the collateral. The collateral was the north pasture. Evelyn had read the contract 3 times. She'd read it with a lamp at midnight, and she'd read it again at dawn, and she'd taken it to the lawyer in town, a small, careful man named Aldrich, who charged by the quarter hour and made her feel like she was paying him to be worried on her behalf. And Aldrich had said, yes, that clause appeared to be enforceable, and no, he wasn't sure there was much to be done about it. There's always something to be done, Evelyn had told him. Aldrich had looked at her over his glasses. Mrs. Mercer, Miss Mercer. Miss Mercer. In my experience, when a man like Grimes has the law arranged to his satisfaction, the options available to the other party are limited. What options exist, she said, even limited ones. He had given her 2. Pay the $60 in full before June 1st, or find evidence that the contract clause had been obtained through fraudulent means, in which case it could be challenged in court. The second option required proof. The first option required money that was currently not available, because a hard winter had pushed expenses past what the spring accounts were going to cover. $60. It wasn't a catastrophic sum in the abstract. In the specific, in the middle of a difficult year on a working ranch with a sick horse and wages to pay and a roof that needed new shingles on the west side, it was a wall. She had not told her father about the full scope of what she'd learned from Aldrich. Nathan knew about the debt. He didn't know about the clause. She told herself she was protecting him. She was partially right. She was also protecting herself from watching him realize how bad things actually were, because Nathan Mercer's version of crisis management involved a lot of shouting and very little that was useful, and she didn't have energy for that on top of everything else. This was what her life looked like in the weeks before Silas Boone arrived on their land. A problem she was carrying alone. A debt she didn't know how to solve. A man in town who smiled at her with something patient and cold behind his eyes. Silas fit into the rhythm of the ranch without making a noise about it. That was what Evelyn noticed first, and kept noticing. He didn't arrive with opinions about how things should be done differently, the way some hired men did. He didn't try to establish himself with stories about previous outfits or demonstrations of what he could do. He showed up the first morning at the corrals while it was still dark, saddled his own horse, and asked Luke Mercer where he was most needed. Luke, who was 17 and already suspicious of most adults as a matter of policy, said the east fence was down in 2 places and the cattle were drifting. "Show me," Silas said. Luke showed him. They spent the day working fence together and came back at dark and ate supper. And Luke didn't say much, but he came down to breakfast the next morning without being called, which was not something that happened with regularity. By the end of the first week, Nathan had given Silas the mare that no other hand would touch, a rangy bay with a sour disposition who had put 2 men on the ground. And Silas had spent 3 evenings in the round pen with her, not breaking anything, just moving, until the mare decided he wasn't worth fighting and started watching him instead of bracing against him. Nathan watched from the fence rail and said nothing, but his posture said a thing or two. Evelyn watched from the kitchen window. She told herself she was watching the horse. On the 8th day, she found Silas at the far end of the equipment barn, repairing a harness that had been hanging broken on a nail since the previous autumn. She'd walked out there for a different reason. A missing invoice she thought might have ended up in the wrong bin, and pulled up short when she saw him in the lantern light, working the leather with a waxed needle, his hands moving with the particular unhurried attention of a man who is good at something and doesn't need anyone to watch him do it. "I didn't hire you to do that," she said before she'd thought about it. He looked up. "I know. It needed doing. We've got enough on the work list without adding." "Miss Mercer," he said, "it's an hour. The harness will last another 10 years if it's done right. Do you want me to stop?" She looked at the harness. She looked at him. "No," she said. She stayed. She didn't mean to. She found the invoice in the third bin, which should have been sufficient reason to leave. But she stayed, and she sat on an overturned crate, and he kept working, and after a while the silence between them had enough room in it that she said, "How long have you been moving from outfit to outfit?" "Long time," he said. "Since I was 20. You're what, 30 now?" 31. "That's a long time to keep moving." "Yes," he said. She waited for more. He kept his eyes on the harness. "You don't explain yourself much," she said. "Not generally, no. Most people do, whether you want them to or not." He tied off a stitch. "I find that explaining yourself gives people material they don't always deserve to have." That landed somewhere specific in her chest, and she recognized it. The particular resonance of a thing someone says that matches a thing you already believe but haven't put into words. She didn't say anything for a moment. "My fiancé drowned," she said. 7 years ago. That's what the dress is." He set the harness down on his knee and looked at her. "His name was Thomas Hale," she said. "He was 24. He was crossing the Clearwater with a small cattle drive, and the river was up, and he went in and he didn't come out." She said it flat, with no performance on it, because she had said it enough times over enough years that the raw part of it had been worn down to something she could carry steadily. "My mother made the dress for the wedding. She'd been sick. I don't think any of us understood how sick, and I think she put everything she had into finishing it. She died 11 days after it was done." "I'm sorry," Silas said. It was the same plain quality as everything else he said. No extra weight on it, no reaching for significance. Just an honest statement. "The dress is all I have of both of them, is the thing," she said. "I don't know why I wear it in the field. I started doing it the first spring after Thomas died, and I've done it every year since, and I've never been able to explain it properly, not even to myself." "You don't need to explain it," he said. "No? Some things you do because they're true," he said, "not because they make sense." She looked at him for a long time. He picked up the harness and went back to work, and she sat on her crate in the lantern light, and outside the wind came down off the ridge and moved through the cottonwoods, and for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she did not feel entirely alone with what she was carrying. The second week brought a development nobody had expected. Tom Aldrich, the lawyer, rode out to the ranch on a Tuesday morning with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that Evelyn had come to associate with news she was going to find unpleasant. She met him in the yard before he reached the house. "Miss Mercer," he said, "I've been doing some additional looking into that contract." "And?" He glanced toward the house. "Is there somewhere private we might—" "Here is fine," she said. "Tell me." He looked like he'd rather not. "I've been examining the public land records for the past week. The parcel that Grimes is claiming as collateral, the North Pasture, appears in his records with a different boundary notation than what's in the county surveyor's original plat from 1874. Evelyn's attention sharpened. "Different how?" "The original plat shows your father's northern property line running to the creek's east bank. Grimes's version of the contract shows it running to the creek's center line." He paused. "That's a difference of approximately 6 acres. "He drew his own boundary," she said. "I can't prove that yet. What I can say is that the discrepancy exists, and if the original plat is correct, and I believe it is, then the parcel being used as collateral includes land that isn't legally your father's to pledge." "Which would make the clause invalid," she said. "Potentially. It would need to go before the circuit judge, and the circuit judge doesn't come through Red Hollow until August." He watched her absorb this. "I'm sorry. I know June 1st is the deadline." What would it take to prove the discrepancy? She said. A surveyor's assessment comparing the original plat to the current boundary stakes. If the stakes have been moved, which I suspect they have, a surveyor could document it. Can you hire one? I can. The cost would be... Hire one, she said. Whatever it costs. Aldrich left. Evelyn stood in the yard for a long moment, looking at the north pasture, which was green and flush with the early spring grass, the creek running bright along its edge. Someone had moved the boundary stakes. She was almost certain of it, and the only person with a reason to do that was Hector Grimes. She went back into the house. Silas was at the table with Luke, the two of them looking at a fence map she'd drawn up earlier in the season. Silas pointing at a section near the west ridge and saying something about grade and drainage. Luke was actually listening, which continued to be remarkable. She stood in the doorway for a moment without either of them noticing her. She thought about the $60. She thought about the clause in the contract. She thought about Hector Grimes standing in the general store with his hand around her arm, and the particular patience of his smile. Then she went and got her ledger and sat down at the side table and started looking for $60 she hadn't found yet. She found 38. It took her 3 days of working through every account she had, every pending payment, every deferred expense she could defer further, and she found $38 she could commit to by June 1st, without leaving the ranch, unable to pay wages. 22 short. She did not sleep particularly well on the night she confirmed that number. She was sitting on the porch in the dark at midnight, wrapped in her coat, when she heard the screen door and Silas came out and sat on the step below her without asking if she wanted company, which she was coming to understand was simply how he operated. He didn't ask for permission to be present. He was just present, or he wasn't. "You want to tell me what's wrong?" he said. "No," she said. "All right." He sat. She sat. The creek made its sound in the dark, and a coyote called from somewhere up the north ridge. "I'm $22 short," she said. She hadn't planned to say it. It arrived the same way the thing with the dress had arrived, from a place that had bypassed the part of her that usually managed what she said out loud. "Short of what?" he said. So she told him. She told him about the contract and the clause and the north pasture and what Aldrich had found about the boundary stakes. She told him about the $60 and the 38 she'd scraped together and the 22 she couldn't locate. She told him all of it sitting on the porch in the dark, and she was not sure whether she felt better or worse when she was done. "You've been carrying this alone," he said. "Yes." "Since when?" "November." He was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you tell your father?" "Because my father's version of a crisis is to get very loud and then do something impulsive, and I needed time to think it through properly before he knew." "Does he know now?" "He knows about the debt, not the clause, not the boundary stakes." "You're going to have to tell him." "I know," she said. "I'm just trying to get to a position where there's something constructive to tell him alongside the bad part." Silas leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, looking out at the dark. "I've got $22, he said. She looked at him. "No." "It's not charity. Call it an advance against the roundup bonus. You haven't earned it yet." "I will," he said. "You know I will." She looked at him for a long time. He looked back at the dark. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "Because Grimes is the kind of man who already has enough, and he wants your father's land anyway, and I've spent most of my life watching that kind of man take things from people who work twice as hard to build them, and I'm tired of watching it happen." She didn't say anything. The coyote called again, closer this time. "It's a loan," she said finally. "Fine," he said. "I'll pay it back." "Fine." She pulled her coat tighter. "You're a strange man, Silas Boone." "Probably," he said, and in the dark she heard something that might have been the beginning of a smile. She paid Hector Grimes $60 in full on the 1st of May, 40 days early. She paid it in cash, counted it out on his desk in front of his clerk, and got a receipt that she took directly to Aldrich to file. Grimes accepted the money with his usual politeness and his usual patience, and she walked out of his office knowing that $60 had not solved the actual problem, because the surveyor Aldrich had hired had already found what they suspected. The boundary stakes on the north pasture had been moved, not by a foot or two, but by more than 30 yards in 2 places, and the original plat said very clearly that those 6 acres belonged to Nathan Mercer. Grimes had been quietly trying to steal the land for years. The contract clause had been his opportunity to complete it. Now he knew the payment was made and the clause was void, and he was still smiling when she left. She understood then that $60 had bought them time. It had not bought them safety. Grimes still wanted the north pasture. He would find another approach. She drove home in the wagon through the late afternoon light, the receipts folded in her coat pocket, the north pasture rolling green and steady beside the road, and she thought about what Silas had said on the porch. I've spent most of my life watching that kind of man take things from people who work twice as hard to build them. And she thought about the 10 years he'd been moving from ranch to ranch, never stopping, never staying, and she wondered what exactly it was that a man like that was running from, and whether he even knew anymore. She wondered. She did not ask. Not yet. On a Thursday evening near the end of May, Nathan Mercer finally learned the whole truth. Evelyn told him at the supper table, with Luke present, because she had decided that trying to protect them from it was no longer useful. She laid it out plainly. The contract clause, the boundary stakes, Aldrich's findings, the surveyor's report, the plan to bring it before the circuit judge in August. She left nothing out. Nathan listened without speaking, which was unusual enough that Luke kept glancing at him sideways. When she finished, Nathan put down his fork and said, "Why didn't you tell me in November?" "Because I needed time to understand it before you reacted to it," she said. "And I needed you to not go confront Grimes before we had anything solid. I would not have—" He stopped. They both knew what he would have done. "I know, Dad." He picked up his fork again, set it back down. "The surveyor's report is solid?" "Aldrich says yes. And we've got the payment receipt, filed and copied." He looked at her for a long moment. Nathan Mercer was not a man who said certain things easily. Gratitude was among them. Apology was another. What he said instead was, "You did right," which in his language was both of those things at once. Luke said, "So Grimes moved the stakes himself? He just walked out on our land and moved them?" "Sometime in the last few years," Evelyn said. "The surveyor found the old holes." "That's stealing," Luke said. He was 17, and right now, he was furious with the clean, sharp fury of someone who has not yet learned that the world allows certain kinds of theft, if they're done quietly enough and with the right paperwork. "Yes," Silas said from the far end of the table. He'd been quiet through the whole conversation. "It is." Luke looked at him. "So what do we do?" "We wait for August," Evelyn said. "We document everything we can between now and then, and we make sure Grimes doesn't find another angle." "He'll try," Nathan said. "I know," she said. "We'll be ready." She said it with more certainty than she felt. But she looked around the table, her father's worn face, her brother's young anger, Silas's quiet steadiness at the end, and she thought that maybe certainty wasn't the point. Maybe what mattered was that none of them were carrying it alone anymore. Outside, the wind came down off the ridge the way it always did at the end of the day, bending the grass of the north pasture in long, slow waves, the creek catching the last of the light. The dress was folded in its cedar chest upstairs. The wildflowers had been in bloom for 3 weeks now, longer than most years. Spring was staying. The surveyor's report sat in Aldrich's office in a locked drawer, and Evelyn knew it was there the same way she knew about most things she couldn't control, with a low-grade awareness that never quite went away, like a stone in a boot you've learned to walk around. June arrived without ceremony. The roundup was 3 weeks in, and the Mercer Ranch had settled into the particular exhaustion of a working cattle operation at full push, the kind of tired that sits in your bones by 9 in the evening and doesn't fully leave by morning. Nathan was out before dawn every day. Luke came back from the range with his hands torn up and his jaw set in a way that made him look, briefly and startlingly, like his father 20 years ago. The hired hands moved through the work with the wordless efficiency of men who understood the pace was what it was, and complaining about it changed nothing. Silas worked the way he always worked, without theater, without the need to be observed doing it. He was the first to the corrals in the morning and among the last to come in at night, and he did not talk about this, because men who need credit for working hard generally aren't working as hard as they say. Evelyn noticed anyway, because she noticed most things, and because she was trying very deliberately not to notice this particular thing, which meant she was paying close attention to it. That was the problem with Silas Boone. He did not require anything from her. He did not need reassurance or explanation or the particular brand of careful management that most people in her life had required over the years. He just showed up and did what needed doing, and the absence of that particular demand, the absence of needing to handle him, had created a space in her daily life that her attention kept sliding into, the way your tongue finds a loose tooth. She knew what it was. She was not a naive woman. She was 30 years old, and she had loved someone and lost him, and spent 7 years constructing a life around that absence. And she recognized the sensation of beginning to care about a person, the way you recognize the weather shifting before the clouds actually arrive. She didn't trust it. She had excellent reasons not to trust it. She kept her distance in the ways she could manage and let the work fill the rest. The first week of June brought Hector Grimes back into their lives. Not in person. Grimes rarely did anything in person that could be done through an intermediary, but through a letter delivered by his clerk to Nathan Mercer at the general store. Nathan brought it home unopened, handed it to Evelyn without a word, and stood at the kitchen window while she read it. It was politely written, as Grimes's communications always were. It informed Nathan Mercer that Grimes Land and Grazing Company was formally disputing the eastern boundary of the Mercer North Pasture based on a survey conducted in 1882, and that pending resolution of the dispute, Grimes reserved the right to restrict access to the creek crossing at the North Pasture fence line. The letter cited a section of territorial grazing code that Evelyn had never heard of and suspected Grimes had drafted for his own purposes. "He's trying to cut off the water access," she said. Nathan turned from the window. "Can he do that?" "He's claiming he can. Whether the law backs him up is a different question." She folded the letter. "I'll take it to Aldrich tomorrow. I'll come with you." "You don't need to—" "Evelyn." His voice was quiet but final. "I'll come." She looked at him, this tall, weathered man who had gripped everything so tight for so long, and nodded. "All right." Luke came in from the yard while they were still standing there, read the room correctly without reading the letter, and said, "Grimes again?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "What does he want now?" "The same thing he's always wanted," Nathan said. "He just keeps finding new ways to ask for it." Luke sat down at the table with the particular controlled stillness of a young man managing an anger he hasn't yet decided what to do with. Silas came in behind him, stopped in the doorway, and looked at Evelyn. She handed him the letter without explaining it. He read it. His expression didn't change much, which she'd come to understand meant he was thinking rather than reacting, and the thinking was not pleasant. He handed it back. "The creek crossing," he said. "Yes." "If he restricts it, where does that leave the summer pasture rotation?" "Behind by 6 weeks, minimum. We'd have to push the cattle 2 miles north to the public crossing and back every time, which—" She stopped, because the calculation was obvious and saying it out loud just made it more discouraging. "That's what he wants," Silas said. "Not the pasture, not directly. He wants to make the operation difficult enough that your father considers selling." "I know," she said. "He's done this before," Silas said. "Not here. But I've seen this approach. A man like Grimes, he doesn't hit the fence directly. He leans on it from every angle until something gives." Nathan looked at him. "You know men like Grimes?" It wasn't a question. Silas met his eyes. "Yes, sir, I do." "Then you know they don't stop." "Not until they're made to," Silas said. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Outside, one of the horses moved in the corral, and the weather vane on the barn turned in a gust off the ridge. "We go to Aldrich," Evelyn said, because someone needed to move the conversation toward something useful. "We find out what the code actually says, and we don't panic because panic is what he's buying with this letter." Nathan picked up his hat. Luke looked at the table. Silas looked at Evelyn, and in his expression was something she couldn't quite name. Not admiration exactly, more like recognition. The look of someone watching a person do something difficult with competence and understanding the cost of it. She picked up the letter and went to put it with the other documents she was keeping. Aldrich read the letter, read the code section Grimes had cited, took off his glasses, cleaned them, and put them back on, which Evelyn had learned was his version of gathering himself before saying something unfortunate. "The code section exists," he said. "But," Nathan said, "but it applies to established water rights disputes, which requires a filing with the Territorial Land Office, which Grimes has not done. He's citing the code as if he's already filed, but as of this morning, there's no filing." Aldrich set the letter on his desk. He's bluffing. Or he's about to file, Evelyn said. Possibly. If he does, it triggers a 60-day review period during which the disputed access is technically in suspension. He looked at Nathan. That would mean you couldn't legally use the creek crossing for 60 days. The summer rotation starts in 3 weeks, Nathan said. I know. The room sat with that for a moment. What do we do if he files? Evelyn said. Counterfile immediately, citing the original water rights deed from 1874, which predates any claim Grimes might make by 14 years. Aldrich pulled a folder from his cabinet. I've already drafted the counterfiling, actually, on the assumption he might try something like this. Nathan looked at the folder. Then he looked at Aldrich. You did that on your own. Miss Mercer asked me to stay ahead of the situation, Aldrich said, with a small, precise nod in her direction. Nathan looked at his daughter. He didn't say anything, but the look was its own kind of statement. Something between gratitude and the specific discomfort of a man realizing that someone he spent years trying to protect has, without his noticing, become the one doing the protecting. File it today, Evelyn said. Don't wait for him to move first. Aldrich raised an eyebrow. That's an aggressive position. He's been aggressive for 6 months, she said. We've been responding. I'd like to try something different. Aldrich looked at Nathan. Nathan nodded. Aldrich reached for his pen. Well, they were halfway back to the ranch, Nathan driving the wagon and Evelyn beside him, when Nathan said, without preamble, Boone's a good man. Evelyn kept her eyes on the road. He's a capable hand. That's not what I said. I know what you said. He was quiet for a stretch. The road curved along the creek, the water running clear and fast from the snowmelt up on the ridge. Your mother would have liked him, he said. That's all. Dad, I'm not saying anything, Evelyn. I'm saying your mother would have liked him. That's a fact about your mother, not a suggestion about your life. She looked at him. He was watching the road with a studied neutrality that was unconvincing and that they both knew was unconvincing. He's going to leave when the roundup's done, she said. He's been moving for 10 years. That's not a man who stays. Maybe, Nathan said. People change their minds about things. Not about things that deep. He didn't answer. The wagon rolled on. A hawk turned in a wide circle over the north pasture, riding the thermals with the particular patience of something that can afford to wait. She looked out at the pasture, the green of it, the creek glinting along its edge, and thought about what it would mean to lose it. Not just the land, the creek, the grass, the way the morning light hit the water in October. Her mother had loved this view. Thomas had loved this view. She had grown up believing that some things were simply permanent, and then she'd learned they weren't, and the lesson had left a mark she was still navigating around. She was not going to lose this land to Hector Grimes. She had started from that position months ago, but sitting in the wagon in the June light, with her father beside her and the north pasture rolling out to the fence line, she felt it solidify into something harder and quieter than anger. Not fury. Fury burned fast and hot and left you tired. This was more like resolve, the kind that settles into the base of your spine and stays there. She was not going to lose this land. Grimes filed with the Territorial Land Office on a Friday, 3 days after Aldrich filed the counterclaim. The timing was designed to create confusion, 2 competing filings, a bureaucratic tangle that would slow everything down while Grimes continued to apply pressure from other angles. Aldrich sent word by courier, and Evelyn sat with the news for exactly as long as it took her to pour a cup of coffee and drink it, and then she went to find Silas. He was in the equipment barn again, which had become a kind of default location for conversations that needed some privacy from the rest of the household. She found him sharpening tools at the workbench, a methodical scrape of steel on stone that didn't slow when she came in. He filed, she said. I figured he would. Aldrich has the counterclaim on record. He says the pre-existing rights deed should hold, but it goes to the territorial office for review, and that takes 60 days, Silas said. Yes. Which puts resolution in August. Which is when the circuit judge comes through anyway, she said. So, theoretically, if we can get both the boundary dispute and the water rights issue before the judge at the same sitting. You consolidate everything into one hearing, Silas said. He set down the file and turned to look at her. That's smart. Aldrich's idea, originally. I refined it. The edge of his mouth moved. That not-quite smile she'd started cataloging without meaning to. I believe both parts of that, he said. She leaned against the doorframe. The afternoon was warm, the kind of early June warm that felt like a promise the summer might keep. "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask," he said. "Your brother," she said. "You mentioned him once to my father. You said you didn't have family anymore." He was quiet. "You don't have to—" "His name was Daniel," Silas said. He said it the way she'd said Thomas's name, flat, with the rawness worn down to something manageable. "He was 4 years older than me. We were working a spread up in Colorado, the two of us, saving to buy our own place. He was checking a fence line on the upper pasture, and the horse spooked on a ledge and went over." He picked up the file again, turned it in his hands. "I was the one who'd said to check that fence line. It had been on the work list for a week, and I kept pushing it down the list, and finally I told him to go do it that morning." Evelyn didn't say anything. She understood the particular shape of that kind of blame, the ones where the calculus is simple and wrong and permanent. "It wasn't your fault," she said. "I know that," he said. "Most of me knows that. Knowing it doesn't change the feeling." "No," she said. "It doesn't." He set the file down. "I left Colorado a month after. Figured if I didn't stop anywhere long enough to build something, I couldn't be the reason it fell apart." He said it without self-pity, just a factual accounting of a decision a younger version of himself had made and then lived inside for a decade. "I'm not sure it worked the way I planned." "What does that mean?" He looked at her steadily. "It means I'm standing in your equipment barn in Red Hollow, Wyoming, having the most honest conversation I've had in 5 years, and I'm not sure what to do with that." The air between them had a specific quality to it that Evelyn recognized and that she did not fully trust herself around. She pushed off the doorframe. "You could start by finishing the sharpening," she said. He did smile this time, small and real. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She went back to the house. She made it all the way to the porch before she stopped and stood there for a moment, her hand on the door, looking at nothing in particular. She was in trouble. She knew it. She had known it for a while, the way you know a storm is coming before you can see it. Something in the pressure of the air, something in the way the light changes. She went inside and started supper. The second week of June, Grimes moved again. This time it was Luke he targeted, which was either a miscalculation or a very deliberate choice, and Evelyn was not sure which was worse. Two of Grimes's men came across the north pasture fence line on a Wednesday morning while Luke was riding that section alone and told him that the creek crossing access was under dispute and he needed to move his cattle back from the fence. Luke was 17 and had his father's blood and approximately zero patience for being told what to do by men he didn't respect, and the confrontation that followed was not, by anyone's account, diplomatic. He came back to the ranch with a split lip and his shirt torn at the collar, and Evelyn met him in the yard before he reached the house. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the defiance of someone who knows they handled something badly and is not yet ready to admit it. "How many?" she said. "2. "Are they—" "They're fine," he said. "More or less." He touched his lip. "I'm fine too, in case you were wondering." "I can see that." She didn't reach for him. He was 17 and would hate that. "Luke, tell me exactly what happened." He did. She listened without interrupting, which took effort, because the picture that emerged, Grimes's men on Mercer land, telling a 17-year-old boy to move cattle that had every legal right to be where they were, made the back of her neck prickle with a cold, specific anger. "You shouldn't have hit them," she said when he was done. "They were on our land." "I know, but now Grimes has something to use. If he claims our people initiated physical contact—" "They were on our land," Luke said again, louder. "Luke!" Her voice was flat and even. "I know. And I'm telling you that being right and being smart are sometimes different things, and we need to be both right now." He looked at her with the frustration of a young man who understands the logic of what's being said and resents it anyway. She understood that feeling from the inside. Nathan came out of the barn and stopped when he saw Luke's face. His jaw set. "What happened?" Luke told it again. Nathan's expression went through several things: anger, protectiveness, the particular cold fury of a father whose child has been put in danger, and then settled into something harder. "He's escalating," Nathan said. "Yes," Evelyn said. "That means we're getting to him. The filings are worrying him." "Probably." Silas had come out of the barn behind Nathan, and he stood now slightly to the side, listening without inserting himself. Evelyn glanced at him, and he gave her a small, steady look that she'd come to translate as, "You're reading this right." "We don't retaliate," she said. "Not physically, not legally outside what we've already filed. We document what happened today, exactly what happened, who said what, where they crossed the fence line, and we get it to Aldrich by end of week." "And then what?" Luke said. "And then we keep doing the work," she said. "We don't let him make us stupid." Luke looked at the ground. The fight was going out of him now, replaced by the bone-deep tiredness that follows adrenaline. His lip was swelling. He looked young in a way that caught at something in Evelyn's chest. "Go clean that up," she said more gently. "Supper's in an hour." He went. Nathan stood in the yard for a moment, looking at the north pasture. Then he said quietly, "He's going after my boy." "I know," she said. "That changes things. It changes how angry we are," she said. "It doesn't change the strategy." He looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded, once, and went back to the barn. Silas stayed in the yard. When they were alone, he said, "You handled that well." "Luke's going to be a problem if this keeps escalating," she said. "He's got no patience for—" She stopped. "He's got my father's temper, which is not a good thing in this situation." "It's not a bad thing in general," Silas said. "It just needs a channel." She looked at him. "Is that what you did? Find a channel?" He considered it. "I found a road," he said. "I'm not sure it was the right one." It was the most direct thing he'd said about his own choices, and she felt the weight of it without pushing on it. Some things needed air around them before they could be looked at clearly. She'd learned that about herself over 7 years of carrying her own version of the same problem. "Come help me with the documentation," she said. "You saw the fence line this morning on your ride. I need a witness account." "All right," he said. They went inside together, and the screen door slapped shut behind them, and in the north pasture the creek kept running along its legal and contested bank, clear and cold from the mountains, belonging to no one, and both of them at once. The last week of June was when the rhythm of the ranch shifted in a way that had nothing to do with Grimes. It happened in pieces, small and unmistakable. Silas fixed the porch step that had been broken since April without being asked, and when Evelyn came out in the morning and found it solid underfoot. She stood on it for a moment longer than necessary. Luke started relaying information to Silas before Nathan, not from disrespect but from the practical acknowledgement that Silas would know what to do with it efficiently. Nathan began including Silas in the end-of-day conversations he'd previously had only with Evelyn, the real conversations, about grazing plans and herd condition and what the fall market looked like. And Silas contributed without overreaching, which was a particular skill that Nathan had never managed with hired men before. And Evelyn started sleeping better. She noticed this after several nights in a row of waking up past 5 instead of 3, and lay in the dark examining the fact the way you'd examine something that had appeared unexpectedly in your house, uncertain whether it was welcome or a sign of something you'd failed to notice happening. She was not naive enough to think sleeping better was just about the legal situation improving. The legal situation had not meaningfully improved. It had stabilized, which was different. She was sleeping better because she was less alone than she'd been in a long time, and she knew where that came from, and she did not fully trust what to do with it. The conversation she'd been avoiding happened on a Saturday evening at the end of June, after supper, when Luke and Nathan had both gone to bed early from genuine exhaustion, and Evelyn and Silas were the last two at the table. She'd been looking over Aldrich's latest letter about the August hearing, and Silas had been mending a bridle, and the kitchen was quiet in the way kitchens get when the day is finally done, and nobody needs anything from anyone for a while. "You're going to leave," she said. She hadn't planned to say it. She seemed to keep doing that around him, saying true things before she'd given herself permission. He looked up from the bridle. "When did I say that?" "You didn't, but the roundup ends in August, around the same time as the hearing. And after the hearing, if things go the way we hope—" She stopped. "You'll have done what you came to do. There won't be a reason to stay." He set the bridle down on the table and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, which was unusual because she'd gotten reasonably good at reading him. "You think I'm still here because of the $60?" he said. "I think you're here because the roundup needed doing and you needed work," she said. "I think you stayed because of Grimes, partly, and because the work isn't finished. I think when it is finished—" "Evelyn," he said. It was the first time he'd used her given name without the miss in front of it. She stopped. "I've left every place I've been in 10 years, he said. "I left before anything got complicated, before it mattered, before I had a reason to stay that was hard to walk away from. He picked up the bridle again, then set it back down. I'm telling you that so you understand that I know the pattern. And, she said, and knowing a pattern and being done with it are different things, he said. I'm working on the second part. I'm not there yet, but I'm working on it. She looked at him across the table. The lamp between them was burning low, and outside the July darkness was settling over the ranch with the particular softness of a Wyoming night in summer. And she thought about Thomas and her mother, and the dress in the cedar chest upstairs, and all the careful routes she'd built through her own life to avoid the worst of it. That's the most honest thing you've said to me, she said. I know, he said. I don't know what to do with it. Neither do I, he said. That's new. She picked up Aldrich's letter and folded it. Get some sleep, she said. Roundup doesn't care what either of us is working on. He picked up the bridle. No, he said. It doesn't. She went upstairs. She lay in the dark and listened to the creek and the wind and the usual sounds of the ranch settling into its own nighttime quiet. And she thought that honesty, when it finally arrived between two people who'd been carrying things alone for a long time, had a specific weight to it. Not heavy, not light. More like the weight of something real, which was different from the things you'd gotten used to carrying. She fell asleep before midnight. The summer pressed on, as summers do, indifferent to the people working through them, turning the grass gold at the edges, shortening the nights, bringing the cattle to weight and the hay to cut, and every other thing a working ranch demands. July arrived and the north pasture stood green and uncontested, and Grimes's men did not cross the fence line again, though nobody on the Mercer place was foolish enough to think that meant anything, except that Grimes was waiting for August with the same patience he brought to everything. And in the evenings, after the work was done, and before the dark fully settled in, Evelyn Mercer and Silas Boone sat on the porch, sometimes talking and sometimes not, and the distance between them closed by increments too small to name. August came in hard that year, not the heat. The heat was what it always was, dry and direct, the kind that pulled the moisture out of the ground by mid-morning and left the air tasting like dust and cut grass. What came in hard was the rain, when it finally arrived, and the timing of it, and what it set in motion. The first 2 weeks of August were still. The hearing with the circuit judge was scheduled for the 18th, and the Mercer household moved through those days with the particular tension of people waiting for something they've prepared for as well as they can and are now simply watching approach. Aldrich had filed everything. The surveyor's report was in order. The original water rights deed from 1874 had been located in the county records. Not without difficulty, because someone had misfiled it 2 folders back from where it should have been, and Aldrich had spent most of a Wednesday looking for it with a thoroughness that Evelyn suspected he'd charged her for by the quarter hour, justifiably. The case was as solid as she knew how to make it. That was the thing about preparation. It gave you something to do with anxiety that wasn't just waiting. She had done everything she could do, and now there were 12 days left, and she was waiting. Silas had not left. She had not asked him about it again after their conversation at the kitchen table. He had not brought it up either. What had happened was that July had ended, and the roundup was essentially complete, and he was still at the Mercer Ranch, still rising before dawn, still at the corrals, still at the supper table. Nathan had stopped paying him the day wage and started paying him by the month, which was a different kind of arrangement, and neither of them had made anything of it aloud. But the shift was real and everyone at the table knew it. Luke knew it first, the way young people often know things before the adults around them are willing to name them. He didn't say anything directly. He was 17 and not entirely comfortable with the emotional architecture of what was developing in his household. But he'd started talking to Silas the way he talked to Nathan, which was with an assumption of permanence that was both touching and a little frightening in what it revealed about what the boy needed. Evelyn watched all of it from her usual position, slightly to the side, managing the details, keeping the accounts of everything that wasn't in a ledger. She was good at this. She'd had years of practice. The problem with being good at observing from a careful distance was that you eventually ran out of distance. The morning of the 6th, she came downstairs to find Silas already in the kitchen. He was not a man who spent time in the kitchen. That had always been her territory, and he'd respected it without discussion, the way he respected most of the unspoken arrangements of the household. So finding him standing at the window with a cup of coffee, looking north, was unusual enough that she stopped in the doorway. What? She said. Look at the sky, he said. She looked. The northern horizon had the color of a bruise. Not the clean dark of a night sky, but the yellow-green-gray of atmosphere doing something complicated. The clouds were moving faster than the ground wind accounted for. That's coming in today, she said. By noon, he said. Maybe earlier. She understood immediately what that meant for the cattle still on the summer pasture rotation. The Clearwater ran fast in heavy rain. It didn't need to rain on the ranch itself, just up in the mountains, and the runoff came down the drainage fast enough that a crossing that was safe at breakfast could be dangerous by mid-morning. Thomas had crossed in May, which was snowmelt season. August storms fed the same channels through different means and arrived with less warning. She was already thinking through the logistics when she heard Nathan on the stairs. "We need to move the cattle off the south rotation before that hits," Silas said to him when he reached the kitchen. He didn't preamble it. The Clearwater crossing near the north fence. Nathan looked at the sky through the window. He'd been reading weather in Wyoming for 30 years, and his expression confirmed what Silas had said. "Luke and the two hands are already up at that section," he said. "They went out at first light." "How many head?" Silas said. 60, maybe 70 from yesterday's count. Moving them back takes, 2 hours on a normal morning? 3 if they're being difficult, Evelyn said. "They were already drifting toward the creek yesterday," Nathan said. "The grass is better on the south bank." Silas set his cup down. "I'll go." "I'll come," Nathan said. "You've got the meeting with Aldrich at 9, Evelyn said. "The pre-hearing documents—" "Evelyn, I'll go with Silas," she said. Both men looked at her. "Luke is 17 and he's got two hands who've been on the circuit 2 months and don't know that crossing," she said. "Someone needs to be there who does." She knew the Clearwater crossing. The way she knew most things about this land, from years of navigating it, from having stood on its bank in every season, from knowing where the channel ran shallow and where it dropped sudden and cold. She knew it the way she knew the face of the dress in the cedar chest and the way the light hit the north pasture in October. Some knowledge is not learned from books. Nathan looked at Silas. Silas looked at Evelyn. "Meet me at the barn," he said. They rode out in the early morning light that already had something wrong with it. Too still at ground level, the air carrying a particular charged quality that made the horses move with their ears up and their attention pulled north. Evelyn's mare, a solid chestnut named Clara that she'd been riding for 6 years, kept reading the sky and coming back uncertain. Silas's gray gelding was more settled, which was characteristic. The horse had taken on some of its rider's quality of not wasting energy on what it couldn't change. The north pasture looked beautiful and ordinary as they crossed it, the creek running clear along its bank, the grass holding its late summer green. Everything looked the same as it always did. That was the thing about what was coming. It hadn't arrived yet, and the land had no way to show you the future, only the present, which was fine. "How long have you known that crossing?" Silas said as they moved through the gate toward the south pasture. "Since I was about Luke's age," she said. "My father used to bring us out here when the spring runoff came. Showed us where it was safe and where it wasn't." She paused. "Thomas used it in May, the year he died. He was moving a smaller herd, just 14 head, and the crossing looked manageable. It probably was manageable when he started. By the time he got the cattle across, the water was different." She said it the way she always said it, the worn-down version, the one that didn't bleed. The foreman who was with him said it came up in less than 20 minutes, that fast. Silas was quiet for a moment. "Does Luke know the crossing?" "Enough," she said. "Not as well as I do. He's always had someone older with him." The south pasture opened up ahead of them, the cattle visible in the distance as a dark mass against the dry grass, moving slowly in the way cattle move when nothing has disturbed them yet. She could see Luke at the far edge of the herd. She recognized his horse, a young roan he'd been working with most of the summer, and the two hands flanking the outside. "He's got them between him and the creek," Silas said. He wasn't criticizing it exactly, but his tone said he'd put them somewhere different. "The grass is better down there," she said. He would have let them drift. "Move them upslope first," he said, "then east, away from the crossing." "I know," she said. They reached the herd and Evelyn pushed her mare around the south side while Silas took the north, and she called across to Luke. "Push them upslope," she said. "Now, don't wait." Luke looked at her, then at the sky, which had gone noticeably darker in the 30 minutes since they'd left the ranch. He'd been watching it too. Whatever uncertainty he might have had about the urgency dissolved when he looked north and then back at his sister's face. "I'll take the east flank," he said. It was the right call. She felt a quick, fierce pride in him for making it without being told twice. They moved the cattle with the particular controlled urgency of people who know that rushing the animals will make everything slower. You push too hard, you scatter, and then you're chasing instead of moving, and that costs time you don't have. Silas worked the west side with an efficiency that came from long experience, reading the herd's movement and adjusting without having to think about it, pushing from the right angle at the right moment. The two hands followed his lead because his lead was clearly correct. They had 63 head moving upslope by 9 o'clock. The crossing was 200 yards behind them and below them, and the creek was still running at normal level, and the sky was the color of old pewter all the way from north to west. "We're going to make it," Luke said, coming up alongside Evelyn. The first real gust of wind came down the drainage then. Not a breeze, a wall of air that tasted like rain in cold altitude, and it hit the horses and the cattle at the same time. And the cattle did what cattle do when a wall of cold air hits them without warning. They scattered. Not all of them. Most of the herd held its movement upslope, but the dozen or so on the outer east edge broke toward the creek, because cattle under pressure moved toward water, and the creek was east and below, and they were already pointed that direction before anyone could turn them. "Luke, take your flank," Silas started, but Luke was already moving. He pushed the roan down the slope after the breakaway cattle, fast. Too fast for the grade. But he had good horsemanship and the roan was athletic, and they made the move cleanly, cutting off the first 4 animals and pushing them back. The two hands came in behind Silas to hold the main herd. Evelyn moved wide to cover the south, watching the cattle, watching the creek, watching the sky. The rain started. Not gradual, it came from nowhere to a downpour in the time it took to look up and look back down. The kind of mountain storm that drops more water in an hour than most of August accounts for. The creek would feel it within minutes. The runoff from the upper drainage moved fast. "Luke," she called. He was still working the east edge, pushing the last 3 breakaway animals back up toward the herd. He had 2 of them turned. The third, a young steer who'd been trouble all summer, had gone past him toward the crossing. "Leave it," Silas called. "Leave the one, Luke." Luke heard him. She watched him make the decision, watched him weigh the animal against the situation, watched him almost turn back, watched him decide the one remaining steer was close enough to the fence that it would turn itself. It didn't. It kept moving, and Luke pushed the roan after it, and Evelyn watched her brother chase a single steer down toward the Clearwater crossing in a downpour, while the creek noise rose from its usual murmur to something that could be heard over the rain. "Luke!" She didn't try to keep the alarm out of her voice. No point. He was at the crossing bank. The steer had stopped at the edge, finally uncertain, and Luke came up alongside it and pushed it north, and the animal turned. It turned, and for a moment everything was going to be fine. Then the roan's right front hoof found the soft clay at the bank edge, where the rain had already started to undercut the soil, and the horse's leg went through and the animal went sideways and Luke went off the saddle. She saw him hit the water. It happened between one breath and the next. One moment he was on the horse, the next he was in the Clearwater, and the creek that had been running at its normal level 20 minutes ago was already thigh-deep and running hard and brown with mountain runoff, and he went under and came up and went under again. Evelyn was already moving her mare toward the bank. She was calculating distance and current and where the channel ran and what was downstream. The timber fall, the old pile of logs that had come down in a spring flood 3 years back, 200 yards below the crossing, and she was calculating whether she could get a rope to him before the current reached the timber. Silas passed her on the gray at a dead run. She had never seen him ride like that. He rode every day with a kind of unhurried competence, the same quality as everything else he did, nothing wasted. This was different. This was a man who had made a decision in the fraction of a second that something mattered enough to stop calculating and just move, and he was into the water on the gray before she reached the bank, pushing the horse against the current at an angle, reading the water. She pulled up at the bank edge. She had her rope in her hand. The 2 hands had come down behind her and stopped. Nobody said anything. There was nothing to say. Silas reached Luke 15 yards from the timber fall. He came alongside in the current, bent down from the saddle, one hand in the gray's mane, one reaching, and Luke came up from the water and grabbed his arm, and Silas hauled him up across the horse's neck. The gray found footing, found the shallower water on the inside curve of the bend, and came out on the north bank 10 yards upstream of the timber. Evelyn reached them in 30 seconds. She was off her horse before Clara had fully stopped, which was not smart horsemanship, and which she did not care about. Luke was on his hands and knees on the bank, coughing water, alive. She put her hands on his back. She didn't say anything because she couldn't say anything for a moment. There was nothing between her and the thing she'd been afraid of since the moment she saw him go into the water, and it was too close for words. Luke looked up at her. His face was white and his lip had opened again from June. The same split, reopened on the bank, and he said, "I'm all right," and his voice came out half-drowned. "I know," she said. She kept her hands on his back. Silas sat on the gray with the rain coming down on both of them, one hand resting on his thigh, and he watched the creek for a moment. The timber fall below the bend was completely underwater now, submerged in the surge, invisible. If Luke had reached it, if Silas had been 10 seconds slower, he didn't say any of that. Nobody did. "Can you ride?" Silas said to Luke. Luke sat up. He assessed himself with the honesty of someone who has been knocked around enough to know the difference between hurt and seriously hurt. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." "Take my horse," Silas said. He swung down. "I'll ride back with the hands." "You don't have to." "I know," Silas said. And that was the end of it. They came back to the ranch in the rain, the cattle now safe on the upper pasture where the storm couldn't drive them toward the water. The herd had sustained no losses. The roan had found its footing on the bank and come out on its own, standing now in the yard with its reins trailing and its sides heaving, more shaken than injured. Nathan was in the yard when they rode in. He'd heard the horses and come out, and he looked at Luke on Silas's gray and Silas riding double with one of the hands, and his face went through everything a father's face goes through when he sees his child alive and understands from the appearance of things what nearly wasn't true. He got to Luke and pulled him off the horse. Luke let him. He was 17, and for a moment he let his father hold him like a younger version of himself, and Nathan held on longer than either of them would probably admit to later. Then Nathan looked at Silas. He looked at him for a long moment. The rain was still coming down hard, and they were all soaked, and the yard was mud, and none of that was the point. "Thank you," Nathan said. That was all. Silas nodded. He didn't dress it up. Luke was in bed by noon, which he resented loudly, and which Evelyn managed by the simple method of not arguing about it. She brought him dry clothes and hot coffee and sat on the chair in his room while he told her the whole thing from his perspective, which involved more self-recrimination than she thought was warranted and which she let him work through. "I should have left the steer," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. He'd expected something softer. "You're not going to—" "You know you should have left it," she said. "You said it yourself, so I'm not going to explain it to you." She looked at him steadily. "You're not hurt." "My shoulder—" "Your shoulder will be fine in a week. You're not hurt." She let that land. "You made a bad call, and it went wrong, and Silas was there. That's what happened." He looked at the ceiling. "Is that what you said to yourself about Thomas?" he said. The question arrived without warning, as Luke's questions often did. He was 17, and he didn't yet know to pace them. She felt the impact of it without letting it show. "No," she said. "Thomas died." "That's different. There's no lesson in Thomas that makes it cleaner. He just died." She paused. "What I'm saying is that today ended the way it ended, and that's what you hold on to, not what could have been different." He was quiet for a moment. "Silas went in fast," he said, like he didn't even think about it. "No," she said. "He thought. He just thought faster than other people." Luke turned his head and looked at her with the particular directness of someone who hasn't learned yet to wrap observations in tact. "Do you love him?" he said. She looked at her brother. She thought about the various ways she could handle the question. Deflection, redirection, the careful management of a conversation she wasn't ready to have. "That's not your business," she said. He smiled, which meant he'd taken that as a yes. She let him. The afternoon wore through. The rain eased by 3, then stopped entirely by 5, leaving the world washed clean and the creek running high and loud along the pasture edge. The sky cleared from the west, the way Wyoming skies do after a storm. Abruptly, completely, as if the whole thing had been a different day borrowed from somewhere else. Evelyn found Silas at the corrals at dusk. He'd been checking the horses, the ones that had been out in the storm, running his hands down legs and checking feet with the methodical attention that made him useful and that she'd stopped being able to watch without feeling something she didn't have a clean name for. She leaned against the corral fence. He finished with the last horse and came to stand a few feet from her, both of them looking out at the north pasture in the late light. "You could have waited," she said, "with the rope. I had the angle." "Your rope was good," he said. "My horse was already in the water." "I know. I'm not—" She stopped. "I'm not criticizing. I'm trying to say that what you did—" "Don't," he said. Not harshly, just flat. She looked at him. "Why not?" "Because if you thank me for it, it becomes a thing that happened," he said. "And then it becomes a thing we talk about. And right now I'd rather just—" He stopped. He was looking at the creek, at the high water still running brown and fast along the pasture edge, and his expression had something in it she hadn't seen before, something unguarded. "You were scared," she said. Not a question. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "I was past scared," he said. "I didn't have time to be scared in the water. Afterward," he let out a slow breath. "Yeah." She understood that. She'd felt the same thing, the fear arriving late, after the crisis, when it was no longer useful. The delayed accounting that the body keeps. "He's all right," she said. "I know." "Silas," she turned to look at him directly. "My brother is alive. That's because of you. I'm going to say that, and you're going to let me say it, and then we don't have to talk about it anymore." He looked at her. Something shifted in his face. The thing that usually held itself at a careful remove moved, briefly, and she saw what was underneath it, which was a man who had spent 10 years deciding that caring about things was how you got broken, and who was now standing in the dusk at a corral fence and not sure what to do with what the last 10 hours had revealed to him about true. "All right," he said. "Thank you," she said. "For my brother." He nodded, once. They stood at the fence for a while. The creek ran loud in the evening silence, and the north pasture settled into its long dusk shadows, and somewhere up the ridge a nighthawk worked the dying light. "The hearing's in 12 days, she said eventually. "I know." "If it goes well, it'll go," he said. He said it not as a comfort, but as a straightforward assessment of the evidence, which was more useful. "And if Grimes fights the ruling?" "He'll fight the ruling," Silas said. "Men like that don't stop because a judge says to stop. They slow down. They find different angles." He looked at her. "But fighting a ruling is harder than fighting a filing, and slower, and more expensive." His expression held something she'd come to trust more than enthusiasm from most people. "You've done the right work. The judge is going to see what's there." She looked out at the pasture. In the fading light, it was the color of something almost golden, the late grass lit from a low angle, the creek catching a last line of brightness. She thought about her mother, who had loved this view. She thought about Thomas, who had ridden this pasture with easy confidence and died on a crossing not unlike the one her brother had nearly died on today. She thought about all the years she'd spent managing loss from a careful distance, keeping the accounts, building the careful routes. She thought about what it had felt like to watch Silas go into the water without hesitating. Not the fear of the moment, that was its own thing. What she was thinking about was the something specific it named, and how long she'd been trying not to let it be named. She thought, if that current had taken him, I could not have carried that. It was a simple thought. It arrived without drama. It settled. She had loved Thomas, and Thomas had died, and she had survived it by being careful. Being careful had worked. It had kept her functional and the ranch running and her family intact and every obligation met. She was 30 years old and she was tired of being careful. She did not say any of this. She pushed off the fence rail. "Supper's cold," she said. "Judson, come in before my father eats it all." "He wouldn't," Silas said. "You haven't seen him when he's been worried about Luke," she said. She walked toward the house. At the porch steps, she heard his boots on the path behind her, and she did not wait for him, and she did not look back. And she was aware of him behind her with a specificity that had nothing to do with caution and everything to do with the simple fact that she knew, now, which way her own heart was pointed. That night, Nathan Mercer sat alone at the kitchen table long after everyone else had gone to bed. He sat with a cup of cold coffee and the lantern burning low, and he thought about his son in the current, and about Silas Boone going in after him, and about his daughter standing at the bank with her rope, and about how many years he'd spent trying to keep them both from exactly this kind of moment. He had told himself it was protection. He had told himself that after losing his wife, after watching what Thomas's death had done to Evelyn, the right thing was to hold on tight to what remained, to shield them from risk, to manage the exposure. He had told himself this so consistently that he'd stopped examining whether it was true. Sitting alone in the kitchen in the middle of the night, Nathan Mercer began, slowly and not comfortably, to examine whether it was true. What he arrived at was this: he had not been protecting them. He had been protecting himself from what it would mean to lose them. He had held his daughter back from living because watching her grieve had been the hardest thing he'd endured in his life. And somewhere in the grief of that year he had decided, without deciding it consciously, that preventing her from feeling anything that might go wrong was the same as protecting her. It wasn't the same thing. He could see that now. He could see it in the way she'd stood at the creek bank, and in the rope in her hands, and in the particular set of her face when she'd looked at her brother come out of the water. Not the relief of a woman who'd been held back from life, but the raw, fierce relief of a woman fully in it. He had a lot to think about. He sat with the cold coffee and thought for a long time. Outside, the creek ran high and fast in the dark, carrying the storm off toward the flatlands, taking the runoff from the mountains down through the valley and away, the way water always does, forward and without looking back. The days after the storm were quieter than they had any right to be. Luke's shoulder healed faster than expected. He was 17 and his body had not yet learned to hold on to damage the way older bodies do. And by the third day he was back at the corrals, moving carefully, but moving. He didn't talk much about what had happened at the crossing. That was its own kind of maturity, Evelyn thought. Some experiences you need to wear for a while before they become something you can speak out loud. He'd wear this one quietly, and it would become part of him, the way all the close calls eventually do. Nathan was different after the storm. It was subtle at first, the way changes in people usually are, arriving in small adjustments rather than dramatic declarations. He asked Luke's opinion about the fall rotation at breakfast on a Thursday, which was not something he'd done before with any regularity. He let the boy answer without correcting him halfway through. He stopped hovering at the barn door in the evenings in the particular way he had when Luke was working with a difficult horse, the hovering that communicated a specific brand of doubt disguised as concern. It was not a transformation. Nathan Mercer was not a man who transformed. He was a man who recalibrated slowly and with difficulty, and generally without announcing that he was doing it. But something had shifted in the kitchen at midnight after the storm, sitting alone with his cold coffee and his accounting of himself. And the shift was real, even if nobody named it. With Evelyn, it was different still. On the Sunday following the storm, 4 days before the hearing, he found her at the kitchen table with the ledger open and her coffee going cold, which was her version of not sleeping. She couldn't sit still in the dark the way he could, so she worked instead, and the pattern of cold coffee and open books was how he knew something was running under the surface. He sat down across from her. She looked up. "The hearing's in 4 days, he said. "I know. Aldrich says we're in good position." "Aldrich has been careful not to promise anything," she said, "which I respect, but it also means I don't know exactly what we're walking into." "You've put everything in order that could be put in order," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, the way he did when he was working towards something he hadn't yet said. She waited. She'd learned years ago that trying to pull Nathan Mercer towards a thing he hadn't reached yet just made him move away from it. "I owe you an apology," he said. She looked at him. "Not for anything recent," he said. "For the last few years. The way I've—" He stopped. Tried again. "You've been running this ranch and fighting this fight and carrying the accounts and the legal business and all the rest of it, and I've been standing close enough to supervise, but not close enough to actually help, because if I got close to the problem, it meant admitting how bad it was, and I—" He stopped again. "Dad," she said, "let me finish." He looked at his cup. "I told myself I was protecting you. After Thomas. After your mother. I told myself the right thing was to keep you from taking more risks, more damage. But I was the one scared of the damage. You—" He lifted his head and looked at her. You've been living your life, Evelyn. You've been doing it right in front of me, and I kept treating you like you were about to break. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the first birds were starting in the dark before dawn. You're not easy to fight with, she said, because you believe you're right. I know. And I didn't want to hurt you, after everything. I know that too. He set the cup down. It was still wrong. You deserved someone standing beside you, not behind you watching for damage. She looked at her father, this tall, weathered man who had spent 30 years arguing with the land and winning most of the time, and losing occasionally and never once asking for help with any of it. She had always loved him. She had also spent years being quietly, specifically exhausted by him, in the way you're exhausted by someone who means well and still manages to make everything harder. We're going to win this hearing, she said, and then we're going to have a real conversation about how the ranch is run. Not the accounts, I'll keep the accounts, but the decisions, the actual decisions. He nodded. That's fair. It's not negotiable, Dad. I know, he said. I said it was fair. It was the closest Nathan Mercer was going to get to saying, yes, I understand, I'll do better, and she knew it. She reached across the table and put her hand over his for a moment, briefly, the way their family did things, without making a production of it, and then pulled back and closed the ledger. Go to bed, she said. You'll sleep better than you think. He went. She sat at the table for a while longer, listening to the birds come up outside, and thought about what it meant to be believed in, finally, by someone who had been holding the belief at a careful distance for years. It didn't fix anything. It didn't change the hearing or the boundary stakes or the surveyor's report or the $60 debt that had started all of this. But it mattered in a way that had nothing to do with strategy, and she let it matter, which was also something she was practicing. The night before the hearing, Silas found the cedar chest. Not found. He knew it was there because Evelyn had told him the dress was upstairs, that first morning in the equipment barn. What happened was that he came up to the landing to ask her something about the harness inventory, and her bedroom door was open, and the cedar chest was at the foot of the bed, and she was sitting on the edge of the bed with the lid up and her hands resting on the folded pale blue fabric. She didn't hear him on the landing. He almost stepped back. He would have, except that she looked up at that moment and saw him in the doorway, and neither of them moved for a second. Sorry, he said. Door was open. It's all right. She didn't close the chest lid. He stayed in the doorway, which felt right, not retreating, not advancing. What are you thinking? He said. She looked back at the dress. I used to come in here before things I was afraid of, she said. Not to take it out, just to be near it, I suppose. She touched the edge of the fabric. My mother made this dress to give me a future. That's what I kept thinking, that first year. She put her last real energy into making this dress for a future that didn't happen. And I couldn't figure out whether to be grateful or angry, and I ended up just being numb, mostly. And now, he said. She thought about it honestly. Now I think she made it because she loved me, she said. And the future part, that was never the point. The point was the love in the making of it. She paused. It took me 7 years to figure that out, which is embarrassing. 7 years isn't very long, he said, for something that complicated. She looked at him in the doorway. What did you come up to ask me? The harness inventory can wait, he said. What were you going to ask, Silas? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I was going to ask if you needed anything before tomorrow. That wasn't a harness question. No, he said. It wasn't. She looked at him with the particular directness she'd had since the first morning in the field. The quality that had startled him then, and that he'd come to understand was simply how she looked at things she considered important. She didn't look away from things. Come in, she said. Sit down. He came in and sat in the chair near the window, and she sat on the edge of the bed with the cedar chest open, and the lamp between them was burning at the level lamps burn late in the evening when no one has thought to turn them up. You're afraid tomorrow will go wrong, he said. I'm afraid of what happens if it does, she corrected. The hearing itself. I know what's in those documents. I know the case. Aldrich knows the case. I'm not afraid of the hearing. She folded her hands on her knee. I'm afraid of what Grimes does next if the judge rules our way, because he will do something next. Men like that don't stop. No, Silas said. But they get slower and more expensive. And when it costs a man like Grimes more than he's gaining, he eventually redirects. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. The hearing is the turning point, not the end. The turn. After tomorrow, you'll be fighting him from the high ground instead of the low. That's different. You sound certain. I'm not certain, he said. I'm practical. The practical reading of what you have is that it's enough. She looked at the dress and the chest. My mother would have liked you, she said. It came out simply, without strategy, the way things came out when she wasn't managing herself. She'd noticed she did that more around him than around anyone else in recent memory, and she'd stopped deciding whether it was a problem. He looked at her steadily. That's a significant thing to say. I know. She met his eyes. I mean it. The lamp burned. Outside the window, the ranch was settling into its nighttime quiet. The horses in the corral. The creek still running high from the storm, though lower now, the ridge against the dark sky. I've been thinking about what I said at the kitchen table, he said. About the pattern. About working on it. I remember. I want you to know it's not abstract, he said. It's not theoretical. What I'm working on. He said it carefully, not because he was being evasive, but because he was a man who had learned to distrust his own certainties, and so he spoke them slowly. I want to stay. Not through the hearing, not through the fall. I want to stay. Evelyn Mercer was 30 years old, and she had been careful for a long time, and she sat on the edge of the bed with her mother's dress in the chest beside her, and she felt the careful distance she'd maintained since Thomas, since the grief and the years after, began to close. Not collapse, close, deliberately, because she was choosing it, not because it was happening to her. Then stay, she said. He looked at her for a moment. That's it, he said. What were you expecting? I don't know. More resistance, maybe. I've been resisting for 7 years, she said. I'm tired. The edge of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, something more private than that. I'm not an easy man, he said. I'm not an easy woman, she said. We'll manage. He reached across the space between them and took her hand, not urgently, not dramatically, just took her hand and held it, and she let him, and the lamp burned between them, and outside the Wyoming night was clear after the storm, in the particular way Wyoming gets clear, like the sky had been washed down to its actual depth. She closed the cedar chest lid with her free hand, not putting it away, just closing it for tonight. It would be there tomorrow. The morning of the 18th arrived with the flat, clear light of a high-altitude August day, the kind that has no weather excuses to offer anyone. Evelyn was up at 5 and at the table with coffee by 5:15, and by 6 the whole household was in motion with the particular organized tension of people who know they need to be somewhere important and are managing the gap between preparation and action. Aldrich met them at the courts at 8:30. He was carrying a leather satchel that looked like it had been with him since territorial days, and he shook Nathan's hand and nodded at Evelyn and looked at Silas, with the particular appraisal a careful man gives to someone he's heard about but not met in a professional context. This is Silas Boone, Evelyn said. He's a witness to the fence line and the boundary stakes. He rode that section in May. Aldrich considered this. I may need him. I know, she said. Grimes arrived with his own lawyer, a man from Cheyenne named Pollard, who had the polished manner of someone accustomed to territorial courtrooms and who looked at Aldrich with the particular confidence of a man who has won against opponents like this before. Grimes himself was impeccably dressed and entirely composed, and he nodded at Nathan Mercer in the corridor outside the courtroom with the warmth of a man who harbors no specific feelings about the person he is actively trying to dispossess. Nathan nodded back. He did not smile. He had his hat in his hands and his jaw set, and he looked like 30 years of working land that was trying to kill him, which was accurate, and it was not a weak look. Luke was not there. Evelyn had made that decision 2 days prior and had told him directly. You're a witness if Aldrich needs you, she'd said. You're not there to watch. You're 17 and your face says everything you're thinking, and I need the room to say what I need to say without Grimes's lawyer using your expression against us. Luke had argued and then had not argued, which meant he understood she was right and had ridden out to the north pasture that morning to be useful with his hands and his energy, rather than sitting in town making himself miserable. The courtroom was small and smelled like wood and dust and old paper, the way every frontier courthouse smelled. Circuit Judge Harold Tate was a compact man in his early 60s with gray mutton chops and the eyes of someone who had seen a considerable quantity of human nature pass through a courtroom and had organized his opinion of it into a functional but not optimistic framework. He came in without ceremony, sat down, and looked at the two tables before him. Mercer versus Grimes Land and Grazing, he said. Two claims. Boundary dispute on the North Pasture and water rights on the Clearwater Crossing. He opened the file on his desk. I've read the preliminary filings. Mr. Aldrich, you want to start? Aldrich started. He was not a theatrical lawyer. He was the opposite, a man who presented evidence in the same tone he used to order lunch, which Evelyn had initially found unsatisfying and had come to understand was a significant strategic advantage. He put the 1874 plat before the judge. He put the surveyor's report beside it. He put Aldrich's photographs of the stake holes, the original positions, documented in the ground, beside the surveyor's report. He explained the discrepancy in the contract clause in the same tone a schoolteacher uses to explain arithmetic, and he sat down. Pollard went next. He was polished and he was effective, and he put forward the 1882 survey that Grimes had commissioned, the one that showed the altered boundary. And he made a capable argument that the 1882 survey superseded the original plat, that boundary adjustments were routine, and that the water rights claim was a matter of established practice rather than recorded deed. The judge looked at both surveys for a long time without speaking. Then he said, Mr. Pollard, who commissioned the 1882 survey? Pollard said, my client, Hector Grimes. And who conducted it? Pollard named a surveyor. The judge wrote the name down. Mr. Aldrich, your surveyor found evidence of relocated stake positions. Yes, Your Honor. The photographs show the original holes at a distance of 31 yards inside the current stake positions on the eastern line. The stakes were moved 31 yards onto Mercer land. Our surveyor's assessment, yes. The judge looked at Grimes. Grimes looked back with his characteristic composure, and in that composure Evelyn saw something she recognized from all her months of dealing with him. The patience of a man who has prepared for many contingencies and is now deciding which of them applies. I'd like to speak to your 1882 surveyor, the judge said to Pollard, before I rule on the boundary question. Pollard said, Your Honor, that surveyor passed away in 1885. The silence that followed was brief and specific. Convenient, the judge said. He did not say it with particular inflection. He said it the way he might say it rained on Tuesday, as a fact he was filing. The water rights question took another hour, because Pollard was good and the territorial grazing code was genuinely ambiguous in places, and Aldrich had to work through the 1874 deed section by section with the judge following along. Evelyn sat at the table and kept her hands still, and her face arranged into something that communicated engaged patience, which cost her more effort than anything she'd done in months, because what she wanted to do was stand up and tell the judge about November, and the contract clause, and the boundary stakes, and Hector Grimes's hand on her arm in the general store. She did not. That was not the case. The case was the documents, and the documents were doing the work they'd been assembled to do. When Aldrich finished with the water rights deed, the judge sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment, literally looked at the ceiling with the air of a man consulting something up there, and then looked back at both tables. I'm going to rule on the boundary question now and take the water rights question under advisement for 48 hours, he said. On the boundary, the evidence before me supports the Mercer original plat. The 1882 survey is not admissible as a superseding document given the chain of commission and the documented evidence of stake relocation. He looked at Grimes directly. The North Pasture boundary reverts to the 1874 plat. Mr. Grimes, your claim to the 6 disputed acres is dismissed. Grimes said nothing. He sat with the particular stillness of a man who is prepared for this contingency and is already elsewhere in his thinking. On the water rights, I'll have a ruling by Friday, but I'll tell both parties now that a water rights deed from 1874 is going to be difficult to argue against. He gathered his papers. We're in recess. He was gone before anyone at either table had fully moved. Aldrich turned to Evelyn. He looked like a man who has just watched a watch. He's been winding for months run correctly and is relieved but not entirely surprised. That's the boundary, he said. Yes, she said. Water rights will follow. I know. She let out a breath she'd been managing for approximately 90 minutes. It was not a dramatic breath, just the body's accounting. Nathan put his hand on her shoulder, briefly, the Mercer way, and then took it away. Silas was standing behind them and she looked back at him, and he gave her a small nod that meant exactly what she needed it to mean. They filed out into the corridor. Grimes and Pollard were already ahead of them, moving toward the door, and Grimes did not look back. He walked with the same measured pace he always walked, and he went through the courthouse door into the August morning, and Evelyn watched him go and understood that Silas had been right. This was the turning point, not the end. Grimes would regroup. He would look for another angle, but he would be doing it from lower ground now, and with the judge who had used the word convenient in a specific tone, and with Aldrich's files already assembled and ready. Let him look. The water rights ruling came on Friday, as promised, and it went the way Aldrich had said it would. The 1874 deed held. The Clearwater crossing remained uncontested Mercer access, as it had been for 14 years before Grimes had filed his claim. Evelyn read the ruling at the kitchen table on a Friday afternoon with the windows open and the August air coming through carrying the smell of late summer grass, and she set it down and sat with it for a moment. It was over. The legal part. The part she'd been managing since November. The part she'd carried alone through the winter and into the spring, and through Grimes's escalations and the boundary stakes and the $60 and Luke in the creek. That part was over. There would be no more letters from Grimes's clerk, no more water rights filings, no more men crossing the north fence line to tell a 17-year-old boy to move his cattle. She had not let herself feel how heavy it was until this moment, because feeling the weight of something you're still carrying makes it harder to carry. Now she let herself feel it, and it was considerable. Nathan came in while she was still sitting there. He read the ruling over her shoulder without asking. He put it back on the table and went to the window and stood there looking out at the north pasture, which was visible from the kitchen window in its entirety. The green of it, the creek glinting along its legal and uncontested bank, the fence line running exactly where the 1874 plat said it ran. Your mother would have hated all of this, he said. The lawyers and the filings and the waiting. She had no patience for bureaucracy, Evelyn agreed. No. He was quiet for a moment. She would have been proud of how you handled it. Evelyn looked at the ruling. I had help. You let it, he said. The help was there because you asked for it and knew what to do with it. That's different from being helped. She thought about that. It was true. And it was also the kind of thing she'd been slow to take credit for, the way women who carry a lot of responsibility often are. The carrying becomes invisible, normalized, and so the skill of it stops registering as something that deserves recognition. She let it register this time. Thank you, she said. He turned from the window. He looked like he wanted to say something else and was deciding whether he had the vocabulary for it. He reached for his hat instead. I'm going to check the east fence, he said. I know, she said. He went. The door closed behind him. It was as much of a conversation as Nathan Mercer had in him on a given subject, and it was more than he'd managed in years, and she took it for what it was. She found Silas at the round pen that evening, working the bay mare, the one Nathan had given him in May, the one no other hand would touch. The mare was different now. Not docile, she still had opinions about everything and expressed them frequently, but she'd developed a working relationship with Silas that was based on mutual respect rather than the previous terms of open conflict. Evelyn watched from outside the fence rail, and she watched Silas more than she watched the horse, because she was done pretending otherwise. He saw her and brought the mare to a walk and came to the rail. Ruling came, she said. Aldrich sent word. He rested his forearms on the top rail. How do you feel? It was a question most people in her life didn't ask because they assumed they already knew the answer, or because they were afraid of what a full answer might require of them. Tired, she said, and relieved, and already thinking about what Grimes does next. Stop thinking about what Grimes does next for one day, he said. You can pick it back up tomorrow. She looked at him. Is that a suggestion? It's a suggestion. She thought about it seriously. I'll try, she said. That's the honest answer. He nodded. The mare shifted behind him, blew once, and dropped her head. The evening light was coming in at the long angle it comes in at the end of August, and the ranch was lit in the particular gold that belongs to that specific hour and no other. I want to ask you something, she said. All right. She had been working toward this for weeks without fully knowing it, the way you work toward something when you're not ready to say it directly and need time to build up to it from the side. She was ready now. "That morning in the field," she said, "when you said that was the most beautiful dress you'd ever seen, what were you actually thinking?" He considered it. "I was thinking it was the most beautiful dress I'd ever seen," he said. "That part was true." "And?" "And I was thinking that whoever wore a dress like that to stand alone in a field at dawn was someone worth knowing more about." She looked at him steadily. "And what you said to me in my room, that you want to stay." "Still true," he said. "You understand it's not simple," she said. "The ranch is complicated. My father is complicated. I'm complicated." "I understand that," he said. "I'm not looking for simple." "You've been moving for 10 years. "I know." "Stopping is different from visiting," she said. "Stopping means—" "It means I'm here," he said. "Not through the fall or through the next problem or until something else comes up. Here." He looked at her with the same directness he'd brought to everything since the first morning. "I know the difference. I've been running from the difference for a decade. I know what it looks like." The mare moved behind him again, and he put a hand back without looking to steady her, and the horse settled, and it was such a small thing, that automatic competence, that unselfconscious care, that it reached somewhere in Evelyn's chest that she'd been keeping closed. "I'm not putting the dress away again," she said. He waited. "I've been thinking about what my mother made it for," she said. "She made it for my future, whatever that meant. She didn't make it to live in a cedar chest, and I've been storing it, like it would keep better in the dark." She paused. "I don't want to store it anymore." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "What did you want to do with it?" "I want it to be part of something that's actually happening," she said. "Not something that almost happened once." He was quiet. She watched him understand what she was saying and watch him decide how to carry it and settle. "That's not something I'd say no to," he said. It was not a grand declaration. It was Silas Boone saying something true in the plainest way available to him, which she'd come to understand was how he expressed the things that mattered most. The things he dressed up were the small ones. The things that counted came out plain. "You need to finish with the mare," she said. "I do," he said. "Come in when you're done. Supper's on." She pushed off the fence rail and walked back toward the house, and she did not look back this time either, but she was smiling. Not the careful, measured expression she maintained for the world in general, but the real one, the unmanaged one, the one that happened before she could organize it into something more presentable. Behind her, the mare blew again. Silas said something quiet to the animal. The evening light moved across the north pasture in the slow way summer light moves when it's getting ready to let go of the day, and the creek ran along its legal bank, and the fence line stood where it had always stood, and the land was theirs. Hector Grimes did not disappear from their lives overnight. That was not how men like Grimes operated, and everyone in the Mercer household understood it. What changed was the terrain. In September, he filed a minor grazing complaint with the territorial office. Thin and procedural, something Aldrich dealt with in a single letter. In October, there was a rumor in town that Grimes had been asking questions about the Mercer cattle count and whether the herd numbers matched the grazing allotment. Nathan found out about it through the general store owner, who told him with the particular satisfaction of a man who has spent years watching Grimes intimidate his neighbors and is pleased to see the dynamic shift. Nothing came of the October inquiry. Nothing was going to come of it. The judge's ruling had been filed and documented and was public record, and Grimes's lawyer had apparently advised him that further action against the Mercer North pasture was going to cost considerably more than it could possibly yield. He redirected. Silas had said he would, and he did. Not toward the Mercers, but toward a smaller operation 3 miles east that didn't have a surveyor's report or an 1874 deed or a lawyer who had been preparing counterfiling since spring. Nathan Mercer rode over to that operation in early October, a ranch run by a widow named Carla Fenn and her adult son, and told them what he knew about Grimes's methods. He brought Aldrich's contact information. He sat at their kitchen table and explained boundary stakes and filing dates and the specific code sections Grimes liked to cite, and he did it with a plainness and a thoroughness that would have impressed his daughter if she'd been there to see it. He told Evelyn about it that evening at supper. She looked at him for a long moment. "You drove 3 miles to warn a neighbor," she said. "Yes," he said. "You didn't mention you were going to do that." I didn't know I was going to, he said. I woke up thinking about it and went. Luke was grinning across the table. Nathan told him to eat his supper. Silas said nothing, but the look he gave Nathan was the particular look of a man recognizing something he respects. And Nathan saw it and gave a small nod that was its own kind of conversation. The fence on the east pasture got new posts in October, set properly with Silas and Luke working together over 3 days, while Nathan handled the cattle and Evelyn handled the accounts, and the household moved through the first real weeks of feeling like itself again. Not the held-breath version of itself it had been since November, but something fuller and less braced. It was not a perfect household. Nathan still had a temper that arrived before his judgment most mornings. Luke was 17 and thought he knew more than he did, which was accurate and which he would eventually grow out of, though it would take longer than anyone hoped. Silas had silences that ran deep enough that even Evelyn, who had become fluent in them, could not always tell whether they were peaceful or troubled. And Evelyn herself was still learning, slowly, imperfectly, to ask for help before she needed it desperately, rather than after. None of them were finished people. That was the thing about living. It doesn't complete you. It just continues. And the ones who do well in it are generally the ones who can sit with the continuing without needing it to resolve into something final. Well, on a Saturday in late October, Evelyn went upstairs to her room in the early morning before anyone else was awake. She opened the cedar chest. She took out the pale blue dress and held it in both hands, feeling the weight of it, the fabric her mother had chosen, the stitching her mother had worked by lamplight, the hem her mother had turned by hand through 3 winters of failing health and loving intent. She thought about her mother. She thought about Thomas, and the crossing in May, and the 6 weeks between finishing the dress and the wedding that didn't happen, and all the springs since then, 7 of them, standing in the wildflowers in a dress that had nowhere to go. She thought about Silas at the corral in the August evening light. She thought about Luke's hands on the bank after the creek. She thought about Nathan at the kitchen table at midnight, doing his accounting of himself. She thought about $60 in boundary stakes, and a lawyer with a leather satchel, and a judge who said convenient without inflection. She thought about what it means to carry something for a long time, not the carrying itself, which she knew something about, but the moment when you finally decide the carrying was for something, that it brought you somewhere worth being, that the weight of it wasn't wasted. The dress had been waiting for a future. It had waited through 7 years of springs and a cedar chest and all the careful roots she'd built through her own life. It had waited while she learned to be strong enough to not need anything from anyone, and then while she learned, much harder, that not needing anything from anyone was not the same as being whole. She folded it over her arm and walked to the window. The north pasture was visible in the October morning, the grass gone gold and the creek lower than its August storm height, but still running clear along the bank that was theirs and had always been theirs. The fence line stood where it had always stood. She heard Silas at the corrals below, the sound of the gate, the horse moving in the early morning, the particular unhurried rhythm of a man who has decided to be somewhere and is being there without apology. She looked at the dress in her hands. Her mother had made it to give her a future. The future had been deferred, interrupted, folded and stored, and it had waited with the patience of something made well, because things made with love tend to hold their form even in the dark. It was time to stop storing it. She went downstairs with the dress over her arm and put the coffee on, and outside the October sky was the particular blue that comes at altitude after a cold night, clear down to the horizon, with the early light starting to find the tops of the ridge, and somewhere in the cottonwoods along the creek, the first of the fall birds were making their deliberate preparations, and the ranch was waking up the way it always did, one sound at a time, one person at a time, moving toward whatever the day was going to ask of it. She stood at the kitchen window with the dress over her arm and her coffee warming her hand, and she looked out at the north pasture and the creek and the fence line and the sky, and she felt, not happiness exactly, because happiness is too clean a word for what complicated people feel in complicated circumstances, but something real, something that had earned its presence by surviving everything that had tried to prevent it. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. Silas found the dress on the kitchen table on a Sunday morning in November, not folded the way it had been in the cedar chest, folded with the particular careful compression of something being stored against an uncertain future. This time it was laid out flat, both hands' worth of pale blue fabric taking up most of the table surface. and Evelyn was sitting beside it with a needle and thread and a piece of ivory cotton she'd cut from an old shirt of her mother's that had been in the bottom of the cedar chest beneath the dress itself. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up. "Sit down," she said. "Coffee's on." He sat down across from the dress and looked at what she was doing. The ivory cotton was cut into a long, narrow strip, and she was working it into the hem of the dress with small, close stitches. Not replacing anything, not covering anything, but adding to it. Sewing it in beside her mother's original work, rather than over it. "What is that?" he said. "A piece of her other dress," Evelyn said. "The everyday one, the one she actually wore." She kept her eyes on the stitching. "I've been thinking about what you said, that some things you do because they're true, not because they make sense." She made another stitch. "I want the dress to carry both of them, the wedding and the ordinary, the occasion and the everyday." Silas looked at the fabric in her hands for a long moment. "That's a good idea," he said. "I have them occasionally." He got up and poured his own coffee because she was occupied, which was a small thing and had become the natural order of the kitchen over the months, and which neither of them had commented on because it didn't require comment. He sat back down and watched her work. "I want to ask you something," he said. "You keep saying that and then asking it," she said. "Just ask." "In the spring," he said, "when the wildflowers come back." She stopped stitching. She looked up at him. "I'm not asking you to decide anything today," he said. "I'm telling you what I want. In the spring, when the flowers come up in the north field, I want to be standing in that field when you put the dress on. Not as a stranger who came over the ridge on a horse." He held his coffee cup in both hands and looked at her with the directness that had characterized everything he'd said to her that mattered. "As the man who put a ring on your finger." The kitchen was very quiet. Evelyn Mercer set her needle down on the table. She looked at the dress, her mother's stitching and the new ivory strip she was adding. And she looked at this man across the table from her who had shown up on a gray horse in an early morning field and had, by the slow accumulation of honest days, become indispensable to her in a way she had not allowed anything to become for 7 years. "You're asking me to marry you," she said. "I am. In November." "For the spring," he said. "There's a difference." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about all the things she knew about him, the things she'd learned directly, and the things she'd assembled from observation, the way you assemble a picture of someone who doesn't narrate themselves. She knew he was not an easy man. She knew he had a decade of running in him that would not dissolve overnight, that there would be mornings when the old restlessness surfaced and he would need to choose, consciously, to stay. She knew that was not a small thing to ask of a person or to offer one. She knew that she herself was not uncomplicated, that she had years of managing everything alone built into her habits, and that learning to actually share the weight rather than just allow help with its edges was going to be a sustained effort rather than a decision. She knew all of this. She had been thinking about it since October, in the quiet and honest way she thought about most things that mattered. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "That's it?" "That's it," she said. "You asked. I answered." "You're not going to say—" "Silas." She picked her needle back up. "I've been thinking about saying yes to you since August. I'm not going to make it complicated now." He sat with that for a moment. Then he set his coffee down and reached across the dress, carefully, not disturbing her work, and put his hand over hers on the table. She turned her hand and held his, the way she had in the lamplight of her bedroom in August, and the morning came through the kitchen windows clear and cold and ordinary and exactly right. She told her father that afternoon. She didn't make a ceremony of it. Nathan was at the barn working on the tack, which was where he went when he needed to do something with his hands, and she stood in the barn doorway and said, "Silas asked me to marry him. I said yes. Spring, probably, when the weather allows." Nathan kept working the leather for a moment. Then he set it down and turned around. His face did several things in sequence. She watched him work through it, the first reflex, which was the protective one, the one that had governed him for years. And then what came after it, which was the thing he'd been practicing since the kitchen at midnight after the storm. The deliberate choice to let what he actually felt replace what he was afraid of. What he actually felt, she could see, was relief. And something that looked cautiously like happiness, the guarded kind that men like Nathan allow themselves when they're not sure yet if they're allowed to want it. He's a good man, Nathan said. I know, she said. He'll stay. I know that too. He looked at her for a long moment. You're sure? Dad, I'm asking. I've never been more sure of anything that scared me, she said. He thought about that. Then he nodded, the decisive single nod that meant a thing was settled. All right, he said. He picked up the leather again. Then he set it back down. Your mother would have... I know, Evelyn said. He cleared his throat. I'll go get cleaned up for supper, he said. It's 2 p.m. Then I'll get a head start, he said, and walked past her out of the barn, and she watched him cross the yard toward the house with his hat pulled down against the November wind, and she could see in the set of his shoulders that he was not unhappy, and that was everything she needed from him right now. Luke's reaction was less measured. He was in the north pasture checking fence, his default activity when he had too much energy and not enough direction, which at 17 was most of the time. And Evelyn rode out to tell him rather than wait for supper because she knew he would be furious if he found out he was the last one informed, and she was not wrong. She told him. He stared at her for a full 3 seconds. You're getting married, he said. In the spring. To Silas. Who else would I be marrying, Luke? He looked out at the fence line. He was working something through. She could see it in the way he went still, which was different from his usual motion. He was not, she realized, going to make a scene about it. That surprised her. She had expected enthusiasm or the opposite, and what she was getting was something more complicated. The expression of a young man understanding that things are changing and trying to locate himself in the change. He's staying, Luke said. It wasn't a question. Yes. Good, he said. Just that. Good. He looked back at the fence. This post is going to need replacing before spring. The ground froze around it wrong. I'll tell him, she said. Tell him I know which post to check, Luke said. He doesn't have to redo everything I've already checked. She looked at her brother, this young man who had nearly died in the Clearwater and who had come back from it quieter and more purposeful, and who was right now negotiating, in his own indirect way, his place in the changed arrangement of the household. He was doing it practically, the way the Mercer family did everything that mattered. I'll tell him, she said again. She rode back to the ranch, and the November light was the particular pale gold of a Wyoming afternoon in the season before winter, and the grass was brown and flat, and the creek was running at its low water level, and the north pasture stood unmarked by anyone's stakes but their own. The winter came hard in December and harder in January, which was normal for Wyoming and which the ranch managed the way it always had, by preparation, by not wasting, and by accepting that some stretches of time are simply about endurance rather than progress. The cattle did well on the hay they'd put up. The horses were sound. The roof held except for a section over the equipment barn that leaked in a specific pattern during ice melt, which Silas and Luke repaired on a relatively warm day in late January that neither of them fully trusted but used anyway. Inside the house, the winter had a different quality than previous winters. It was harder to locate exactly, the way the best changes are. You notice the absence of something more than the presence of something new. What was absent was the particular loneliness of a household carrying too much in silence. It didn't mean the house became loud or demonstrative. The Mercer family was not a loud or demonstrative family, and Silas fit into it partly because he wasn't either. What changed was the texture of the quiet. It was no longer the quiet of people avoiding certain subjects, but the quiet of people comfortable enough with each other that silence didn't require management. Nathan stopped correcting Luke mid-sentence. He didn't stop having opinions about how Luke did things. He had opinions about everything and always would, but he started finishing his observation and then actually waiting to see what happened, which was different. Luke responded by asking his father's opinion on certain things, rather than assuming he'd already told him and that it was wrong. These were small adjustments. None of them announced themselves. The household just became incrementally less like a group of people holding their positions and more like a group of people navigating in the same general direction. Evelyn watched all of it with the quiet attention she'd always brought to the people around her, except that she was no longer watching from the careful distance. She was in it, which made it harder to see clearly sometimes and better to live in all the time. She and Silas did not have an uncomplicated winter. That was the truth of it. And she held it without apology because she'd made a decision in November to stop requiring things to be easier than they were. There were mornings when she came downstairs and could see in the way he held himself that the old restlessness had surfaced in the night, the 10-year habit of preparing to move on pressing against the choice he'd made to stay. She didn't try to talk him out of it on those mornings. She poured his coffee and asked him what needed doing and let the day pull him into its requirements, because she'd learned that what he needed on those mornings was not reassurance but engagement, the concrete evidence that staying was producing something real and daily and worth the cost of the thing he was overriding. He told her about this once, in February, late at night when they were the last two awake. He told her it wasn't doubt about her, or about the ranch, or about the choice he'd made. He said it was more like a reflex. His body had learned a specific response to attachment and occasionally still ran it before his mind caught up. She said, "I know." He looked at her. "You know?" "I have my own version," she said. "Mine is to take on more than I need to and not tell anyone. It's a different reflex than yours, but it comes from the same place." He considered this. "We're both running old patterns." "Yes," she said. "We're just doing it in the same house now, which makes it easier to notice." He was quiet for a moment. "That's either very good or very complicated." "Both," she said, "usually at the same time." It was the most honest accounting either of them had given of what it actually meant to build something with another person after a long time of building only alone. And it landed between them not as a problem, but as a truth they both knew how to carry. March arrived, and with it the slow receding of the worst of the winter. The creek ran with snowmelt that was clean and cold and not yet high enough to be dangerous, and the first pale suggestions of green appeared at the south-facing edges of the pasture where the ground warmed first. Evelyn watched for it every morning from the kitchen window. The first real green, the first sign that the season was actually turning rather than just threatening to. She had been working on the dress all winter, not constantly. She had a ranch to run, and accounts to keep, and a household to manage, and all the rest of it. But in the evening, sometimes, she sat with it and added to the hem. The ivory strip from her mother's everyday dress was sewn in now, running the full circumference of the hem in close, tight stitches that she'd been particular about, because the hem was the part of the dress that touched the ground, and she wanted it to hold. She'd also made a small repair to the bodice where the fabric had thinned from years in the chest, reinforcing it from the inside with a piece of cotton that didn't show. The dress looked like what it was, a garment made with love, worn by time, repaired and continued. Not perfect, not pretending to be the fresh thing it had been in 1881. Something older and more honest than that. Aldrich sent a final letter in March informing them that Grimes had made no further filings regarding the Mercer property and that the land office had closed the water rights dispute file as resolved. He added, in his careful lawyer's language, that he had it on reliable report that Grimes had redirected his acquisition interest to properties in a different county, and while he couldn't guarantee that represented a permanent withdrawal from their particular basin, he assessed the immediate threat as concluded. Evelyn read the letter twice and filed it with the others and told Nathan at supper. Nathan said, "Good," and passed the biscuits, which was a completely accurate expression of his position on the matter. Luke said, "Do you think he knows we told the Fenn Ranch about him?" "He knows," Silas said. And it cost him," Silas said. "The Fenns knew to file the right things, and he lost time and money on that approach. He'll look for easier ground." He looked at Evelyn. "That's what I said in August." "You said he'd redirect," she said. "You were right." "I usually am about men like that," he said. It was stated as fact rather than pride. He'd spent enough years watching them to have calibrated his understanding. Luke said, "I kind of wanted him to try something else so we could beat him again." Nathan said, "That is exactly the wrong attitude," in a tone that indicated he privately agreed. The wildflowers came up in the north field in the second week of May. Evelyn stood at the kitchen window on a Tuesday morning and saw the first color in the grass. The yellow of something she couldn't name from this distance and didn't need to, because the fact of it was what mattered, the return of it, the annual proof that the field was still doing what it had always done regardless of everything that had happened in the space between last spring and this one. She went upstairs and got the dress. She had not worn it yet this spring. She'd carried it to the window in November and had been wearing it in a different way all winter. In the stitching, in the repair, in the slow and deliberate work of making it into something she could actually use rather than only preserve. Now she put it on. It fit the way it always had, made by her mother's hands for her mother's daughter, sized by someone who had known the body and the dress better than anyone except the person wearing it. The ivory strip was at the hem, visible if you were looking for it, not visible if you weren't, which was how she'd wanted it. She came downstairs. Silas was at the kitchen table with coffee and the ranch supply list she'd started the previous evening, reviewing it with the methodical attention he brought to everything. He looked up when she came in and went still for a moment. She looked at him, looking at her. She had worn this dress in this kitchen before. The morning she'd come in from the field and made breakfast for him when he was still a stranger, and she was still figuring out what to do about having said something incomprehensible to a man on horseback. That had been 13 months ago, and every distance between that morning and this one had been crossed on foot. "Come out to the field with me," she said. He stood up. He didn't ask questions. He put on his hat and held the door, and she went through it, and they walked across the yard and through the gate and across the north pasture in the May morning, with the creek running bright along its boundary and the sky doing what Wyoming skies do in May, putting everything into it, blue from horizon to horizon, the kind of sky that makes you understand why people stayed in this country despite everything it demanded of them. The field was alive with the wildflowers she'd been watching for. Not the overwhelming carpet of a peak spring. This was early yet, the flowers coming up in clusters and patches rather than wall to wall. But enough. More than enough. They walked out into the middle of it and stopped. She turned to face him. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at her from horseback that first morning, with the honest attention of a man taking in something he wasn't expecting and deciding what it means. Except now he was not a stranger, and she was not alone, and the silence between them had the quality of something chosen rather than maintained. "This is what it was supposed to look like," she said. He understood what she meant, not the specific ceremony, not a particular plan. What she meant was this: the dress in its right place, in the field her mother had loved, with someone beside her who had earned the standing there. "You're not alone in it anymore," he said. "No," she said. "I'm not." He reached into his coat pocket and took out a ring. It was not elaborate, a plain gold band he'd ridden to town for on a Thursday in March when she thought he was checking on a feed order, which she'd suspected at the time but had decided not to investigate. He held it in his palm. "I said in the spring," he said. "You did," she said. He put it on her finger. His hands were not steady, which was the most human thing about the moment and the thing she would remember most clearly afterward, that Silas Boone, who had ridden into a flooded river without flinching, had hands that were not entirely steady when he put a ring on her finger in a field of wildflowers in May. She looked at his face. He looked at hers. There was nothing to say that was better than what was already there, so neither of them said anything for a while, and the morning went about its business around them. They were married in June. Not in a church. The small building that served that purpose in Red Hollow had a roof problem that the congregation was in disagreement about how to fix, and the delay suited Evelyn fine because she had not wanted a formal ceremony and had been working on how to say so without offending anyone. What she wanted was simpler: the justice of the peace, the family, a few neighbors who had shown up when it mattered. The Fenn widow and her son came, which meant something. Aldrich came, which was unexpected and which Evelyn found she was genuinely glad of. She wore the dress. Of course she wore the dress. Nathan escorted her, not because she needed escorting, but because he needed to do it. Needed to be the one to walk beside her to this, to perform the gesture that said, "I am here now. I am not standing behind you watching for damage. I am here." She understood this and let him, and she held his arm, and he was stiff with the effort of not being emotional in public, which was so characteristic of him that it was its own kind of comfort. Luke stood beside Silas. He had lobbied for this position with an argument that was both pragmatic and transparent. He said Silas needed someone to stand with him who knew the family, and Evelyn could see in his face that what he meant was that he needed to be part of this, needed to stand on the side of the future rather than watch it from the outside. She had told Silas, and Silas had said yes without deliberating, because he understood what Luke was asking for, and because he wanted it too. The ceremony was short and plain. The justice of the peace was a man named Garrett, who ran the mill and served in the legal capacity on a rotating basis, and who read the necessary words in a manner that was not beautiful, but was sincere. And sincerity was what the moment wanted. Silas said the words he was supposed to say. He said them looking directly at her, in the same plain and honest way he said everything that mattered. She said her words the same way. The ring was already on her finger. She had not taken it off since the field in May. When it was done, Nathan shook Silas's hand, which was Nathan Mercer's version of an embrace, and Luke clapped Silas on the shoulder hard enough that it would have been rude from anyone else, and was from him a declaration of something he didn't have different words for. Aldrich shook Evelyn's hand and said, "Your mother would have been very pleased," which was the most personal thing he'd said in a year of professional dealings, and she thanked him for it. Carla Fenn brought a cake she'd made herself, which was lopsided on one side and very good, and they ate it on the porch of the Mercer house in the June afternoon, while the north pasture spread out below them green and uncontested and entirely their own. The dress went back into the cedar chest after the wedding. Not the same way it had been stored before, not as something sealed against an unknown future, not as a symbol of what hadn't happened. It went in carefully, wrapped in clean cotton, the ivory strip visible at the hem. It went in the way you put away something that has fulfilled its purpose and that you intend to take out again, for your daughter, if one comes, for a morning in a field when the occasion requires it, for the particular need that arises when you want to be connected to the people who made you and the love that carried across their hands into yours. Things made well tend to hold their form. That was what Evelyn thought, setting the lid back down on a July evening with the windows open and the summer air moving through the house. Her mother had made this dress well, with the love of someone who understood that the things you make with your hands are the things that outlast you. Silas came in from the corrals while she was still standing at the foot of the bed. He looked at the cedar chest. She looked at him. "All right," he said. "Yes," she said. "Just putting it away properly." He nodded. He understood the difference. He came and stood beside her, and they both looked at the cedar chest for a moment, the way you look at something that carries a lot of meaning when you are not in a hurry to define the meaning and don't need to. "Luke wants help with the west fence tomorrow," he said. "He found 2 more posts gone soft." "Of course he did," she said. "He also said, and I'm quoting him exactly, that if you plan on being sentimental all evening, the barn roof isn't going to fix itself." She laughed. It was the real laugh, the one that happened before she organized it, and Silas smiled at the sound of it. And outside the Wyoming summer went about its work in the long light of the evening, the grass moving in the wind, the creek running along its old bank, the fence line standing where it had always stood and where it would keep standing as long as the people who'd built it were around to tend it. This is what Evelyn Mercer understood, in the July of her 31st year, that she had not fully understood before. Grief is not something you get over. It is something you carry until it becomes part of you, and then you carry it differently. Not as a weight separate from yourself, but as part of your own weight, the accumulated material of a life that has included loss. The dress had not stopped belonging to Thomas or to her mother. It had not been emptied of them. It had simply become also something else, something added to rather than replaced, the way the ivory strip had been added to the hem. Beside, not over. You do not have to choose between honoring what you've lost and living what remains. That is the thing she'd needed 7 years to figure out, and the thing she knew now with the kind of certainty you can only arrive at through long and expensive experience. You carry both. You learn to carry both, and one day you find that the carrying has become natural, that you don't have to consciously manage it anymore, that the past and the present have settled into a weight you've grown strong enough to hold without thinking about it, and that the strength you built carrying the past is exactly the strength you need for the life in front of you. That's not a guarantee of anything. Life in Wyoming in 1889 did not come with guarantees, and neither did life anywhere else, and neither does it now. The creek could still flood, the fence could still come down. Men with patience and clean boots could still covet what other people had built. The work did not stop. The worry did not stop. The imperfection of everybody involved did not stop. What stopped was the alone of it. That was what changed in the end. Not the conditions of the life, but the carrying of it. Shared weight is not half the weight. Anyone who has actually shared something difficult knows that's not how it works. But shared weight has a different quality. It has direction. It has someone to look at when the load shifts. Someone who knows where you've been and where you're headed. Someone whose hands you can see moving in the work beside yours. That was what the dress had always been waiting for. Not the wedding, the hands. The presence of another person alongside the grief and the love and the daily difficulty and the daily ordinary. Someone willing to stay in it instead of passing through. Evelyn Mercer Boone had found that. She had not found it by looking for it. She had found it by standing in a field in a wedding dress at dawn, which made no particular rational sense, and by saying something to a stranger on horseback that she hadn't meant to say, but that turned out to be truer than almost anything she'd said since. Some things you do because they're true, even before you understand them. She had learned to trust that. She was still learning. She would keep learning for the rest of her life, which was going to be long and difficult and more than sufficient, and she intended to live all of it without putting any more of it in a cedar chest than absolutely necessary. Silas was already heading back downstairs. She heard his boots on the steps, heard the screen door, heard him cross the porch and call something to Luke in the yard, heard Luke's answer. The particular back and forth of two people who have established, through months of working the same ground, a shorthand that means more than the words. She gave the cedar chest one last look. Then she went downstairs, into the evening, into the ongoing argument with this particular piece of land, into the specific and irreplaceable company of the people who were hers, and she did not look back.